Here's a mind-bending fact that will change how you think about ancient civilizations. Chang'an was continuously inhabited and rebuilt for over 3,000 years, making it one of the longest-serving capital cities in human history. During its golden age, it covered 84 square kilometers, 6 times larger than Rome at its peak, and its population of 2 million made it the first megacity in human history. But here's the question that has puzzled historians for generations. How did this ancient metropolis master urban planning, international trade, and cultural integration so effectively that its principles still influence Chinese cities today? In the next hour, we're going to decode the secrets of Chang'an and discover how this single city became the foundation upon which modern China was built. But before we dive into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please introduce yourself in the comments, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're on to building a global community here. Thank you once more for joining me today, so without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The Cradle of Kings, Zhou Dynasty Foundations. The story of Chang'an begins not with a city, but with a river valley. The Wei River curves through the Guanzhong Plain in what we now call Shanxi Province. To the south rise the Qinling Mountains. North and west stretch protective highlands. This natural fortress, cradled by mountains and fed by rivers, offered everything ancient rulers needed: water, farmland, and defense. Around 1046 BCE, King Wu of Zhou stood at the edge of this plain after overthrowing the Shang Dynasty. His father, King Wen, had already established a settlement called Feng on the western bank of the Feng River. King Wu now built his own capital across the water. He called it Hao. These twin cities, Feng and Hao, occupied roughly the same region where the great metropolis of Chang'an would later rise. Archaeological evidence places them southwest of modern Xi'an, near the confluence of the Feng and Hao rivers. Excavations have revealed foundation walls, bronze vessels, and oracle bones that confirm their existence. The Zhou did more than build cities. They created an idea. They called it the Mandate of Heaven. According to Zhou philosophy, the supreme deity granted the right to rule to virtuous leaders. A dynasty that governed justly kept this mandate. One that became corrupt lost it. Natural disasters, famines, or successful rebellions proved that heaven had withdrawn its approval. This concept transformed Chinese political thought. It meant that power wasn't absolute. It came with conditions. An emperor ruled not by divine right alone, but through moral authority and effective governance. If he failed, heaven itself authorized his removal. The Zhou rulers used this doctrine to justify their conquest of the Shang, but in doing so, they established a principle that would outlive them by millennia. Every subsequent dynasty would claim the mandate of heaven. Every rebellion would invoke it. The concept originated here in the shadow of the Qinling Mountains, and it shaped Chinese political culture for 3,000 years. The Western Zhou period lasted from 1046 to 771 BCE. During these centuries, the Guanzhong region served as the civilization's center. Kings distributed lands to relatives and loyal nobles, creating a feudal network of vassal states. The royal domain in the Wei River Valley remained paramount. The Zhou invested the landscape with meaning. They built ancestral temples and conducted elaborate rituals. They cast bronze vessels inscribed with royal decrees. These vessels, discovered by archaeologists in the region, record land grants, military campaigns, and ceremonial appointments. They provide direct evidence of how the early Zhou administration functioned. The plain itself contributed to Zhou power. The loess soil proved extraordinarily fertile. Ancient farmers cultivated millet and wheat. The rivers provided irrigation and transport. Surplus grain supported a growing population and specialized craftsmen. Bronze workers, jade carvers, and potters created objects of increasing sophistication. But geography offered more than prosperity. The natural barriers protected the heartland from invasion. The Qinling Mountains blocked easy access from the south. The Yellow River formed a barrier to the east. Highlands defended the west and north. An army approaching the Guanzhong Plain faced difficult terrain and long supply lines. This defensive advantage became known as the pass strategy. Later rulers would recognize what the Zhou discovered. Whoever controlled the passes into the Wei River Valley controlled a nearly impregnable fortress. The region could project power outward while remaining difficult to conquer. The Western Zhou eventually weakened. In 771 BCE, the king faced attacks from nomadic peoples and rebellious vassals. The capital fell. The royal court fled east to Luoyang. This marked the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period and the end of the Wei River Valley as the seat of supreme power. For now. The centuries that followed saw the Zhou decline into figureheads. The feudal states they had created became independent kingdoms competing for dominance. This era of fragmentation, known as the Spring and Autumn period and then the Warring States period, brought constant conflict. Philosophers like Confucius emerged, seeking moral order amid chaos. Military strategists wrote treatises on warfare. Technology advanced rapidly as states competed for survival. Yet the memory of Zhou unity persisted. The idea that one legitimate ruler should govern all under heaven remained powerful, and the Guanzhong plain, temporarily diminished, waited. Among the competing kingdoms, one grew stronger than the rest. The state of Qin occupied the ancient Zhou heartland in the Wei River Valley. It inherited not just the strategic geography, but the legacy of centralized power that had originated there. The Zhou had established precedents that would echo through Chinese history. They demonstrated that the Guanzhong region could serve as an effective power base. They created the philosophical framework that future dynasties would adopt. They showed that urban centers in the Wei River Valley could command respect and tribute from distant territories. Bronze inscriptions from the Western Zhou period reveal a sophisticated bureaucracy. Officials held specific titles and responsibilities. Records were kept. Laws were promulgated. The administrative apparatus that the Zhou developed prefigured the more elaborate systems that would come. Religious practices also took lasting form. Ancestor worship became central to social organization. Ritual texts compiled during this period, particularly the Book of Documents and the Book of Songs, preserved Zhou ceremonies and values. Later, Confucian scholars would revere the Western Zhou as a golden age of virtue and proper governance. The archaeological record grows richer each decade. Excavations continue to uncover Zhou-era sites around the Wei River Valley. Tombs yield bronze vessels, jade ornaments, and weapons. Settlement patterns emerge from surveys and remote sensing. We can now map the approximate extent of the twin capitals and their surrounding communities. What becomes clear is that Feng and Hao represented more than mere military camps or administrative centers. They were planned urban spaces with distinct districts for nobles, craftsmen, and farmers. Walls separated sacred precincts from residential areas. The layout reflected social hierarchies and cosmological beliefs. This tradition of planned hierarchical urban design would reach its apex over a millennium later when the Tang Dynasty rebuilt Chang'an. But the pattern started here in the Zhou capitals, where rulers first attempted to impose cosmic order on earthly space. The Western Zhou left no continuous urban settlement. The capitals at Feng and Hao were eventually abandoned, but they established the Guanzhong Plain as China's natural political center. They created the intellectual framework for legitimate rule. They demonstrated the strategic value of the mountain-protected river valley. When the state of Qin later rose to unify China, it did so from this same region. When the Han Dynasty sought to establish a permanent capital, it returned here. The site had proven itself across centuries. The Zhou had shown what could be achieved from this cradle of mountains and rivers. Heaven's mandate might shift from one dynasty to another, but geography remained constant, and in the Guanzhong Plain, geography favored empire. The first emperor's shadow, Qin unification. 20 miles northwest of where Feng and Hao once stood, another capital rose. The state of Qin moved its seat to Xi'an in 350 BCE. The city occupied the north bank of the Wei River, perched on elevated ground overlooking the plain. Duke Xiao and his advisor Shang Yang chose the location deliberately. Shanyang commanded river crossings and trade routes while remaining within the protected Guanzhong fortress. Over the next century and a half, Qin transformed from one among 7 warring kingdoms into the unifier of China. The transformation began with reforms that shocked the traditional aristocracy. Shang Yang abolished hereditary privilege in favor of merit-based advancement. He standardized measures and weights. He reorganized the population into mutual responsibility groups where neighbors monitored each other. He imposed harsh legal codes with severe punishments. These changes created a state machine optimized for warfare. Qin could mobilize resources more efficiently than its rivals. Its soldiers fought knowing that victory brought rewards while failure brought punishment. The bureaucracy functioned with mechanical precision. From Xianyang, Qin rulers directed campaigns that steadily consumed their neighbors. They conquered Shu to the southwest, gaining the fertile Chengdu Basin. They pushed east into the Yellow River heartland. By 230 BCE, Qin stood poised to complete what no state had achieved: total unification. King Zheng of Qin directed the final campaigns. Between 230 and 221 BCE, Qin armies overwhelmed the remaining six kingdoms. The last rival, Qi, surrendered without a fight in 221 BCE. For the first time in centuries, one ruler commanded all the territories once held by the Zhou. King Zheng adopted a new title. He called himself Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Qin. The first emperor ruled from Xi'an with unprecedented authority. He abolished the feudal system entirely. No more would kings distribute lands to relatives who might become rivals. Instead, the empire divided into commanderies and counties administered by appointed officials. These administrators served at the emperor's pleasure and rotated regularly to prevent them from building local power bases. Standardization became policy. The first emperor mandated uniform weights, measures, and currency across the realm. He standardized the writing script. He set the axle width for carts so they could use the same ruts in roads. These measures seem prosaic, but they unified a vast territory economically and culturally. He also standardized thought, or tried to. In 213 BCE, the emperor ordered the burning of books he deemed subversive. Confucian texts, historical records of rival states, and philosophical works that questioned Qin authority faced destruction. Only technical manuals on topics like agriculture and medicine survived the purge. Scholars who protested faced execution or forced labor. This intellectual repression failed in its ultimate goal. Many texts survived in hidden copies or through memorization. But the book burning became a defining image of Qin tyranny, one that later dynasties would condemn. The first emperor poured resources into monumental projects. He connected and extended defensive walls built by earlier states, creating the first version of what we know as the Great Wall. He constructed a network of roads radiating from Xianyang. He built palaces of extraordinary scale. Most famously, he began work on his tomb. The mausoleum complex sprawled across the landscape east of Xianyang, near Mount Li. Ancient historians recorded that the emperor mobilized over 700,000 workers for its construction. The tomb itself remained unopened, protected by deadly mercury traps, according to texts. But around it, the emperor commissioned something unprecedented: an army of terracotta soldiers. Thousands of life-sized clay warriors stood in battle formation in underground pits. Each figure bore unique facial features and details. Infantry, archers, cavalry, and charioteers filled the chambers. The craftsmen created an eternal garrison to guard the emperor in death. The terracotta army remained buried and forgotten for over 2 millennia. When farmers discovered it in 1974, the world encountered physical proof of both Qin artistic achievement and the emperor's obsessive drive for immortality. But we're getting ahead of the story. The first emperor's reign lasted only 11 years after unification. He visited different regions of his empire, erecting stone steles that proclaimed his achievements. He sought magical elixirs that might grant eternal life. In 210 BCE, while on one of these tours, he died. His death sparked immediate crisis. The emperor had not clearly designated a successor. Court intrigue erupted. A conspiracy placed his younger, more pliable son on the throne. The chief eunuch and the prime minister held real power. Within 4 years, the empire fractured. Rebellions broke out across the territories. Former nobles and ambitious commoners raised armies. Xianyang faced siege. In 206 BCE, rebel forces captured the capital. They looted the palaces and imperial archives. They set fires that burned for 3 months, according to historical accounts. The Qin dynasty, which had unified China through ruthless efficiency, collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen. Yet the Qin legacy endured. The administrative structure the first emperor created became the template for all subsequent dynasties. The commandery and county system persisted. The principle of a unified empire governed by a centralized bureaucracy rather than feudal lords became the norm. Later rulers condemned Qin methods, but adopted Qin structures. The standardization policies also lasted. The unified writing script facilitated communication across regions with different spoken languages. Standardized currency enabled trade. The road network connected distant territories. Even the harsh legalist philosophy that guided Qin governance influenced future administrations. While later dynasties publicly embraced Confucianism, they quietly maintained many legalist practices in actual governance. Archaeological work continues to reveal the scale of Qin achievement. Excavations at the Xi'an Palace site show massive foundations and drainage systems. The city covered a substantial area with distinct administrative, residential, and industrial zones. Workshops produced the weapons that armed Qin soldiers. Foundries cast the standardized bronze and iron tools used across the empire. The archaeological evidence reveals an economy organized along industrial lines with mass production and quality control. The terracotta warriors themselves demonstrate sophisticated ceramic techniques. The clay came from local sources. Workers formed the bodies in sections using molds, then customized them by hand. They fired the figures in kilns before painting them in bright colors. Traces of those pigments survive on some warriors today. Weapon production showed similar sophistication. Qin crossbow triggers used interchangeable bronze parts manufactured to precise specifications. Swords received chromium plating that prevented rust. The logistics of equipping hundreds of thousands of soldiers demanded manufacturing capacity on an unprecedented scale. The first emperor's mausoleum itself awaits excavation. Chinese authorities have left the central tomb unopened, citing concerns about preservation technology and the mercury traps mentioned in ancient texts. Ground-penetrating radar and soil samples suggest the historical accounts may be accurate. The underground palace might indeed contain rivers of mercury flowing around a model of the empire. Whether or not future archaeologists open that chamber, the surrounding complex continues to yield discoveries. Recent excavations uncovered terracotta acrobats, musicians, and civil officials in addition to the warriors. The emperor apparently intended to take an entire miniature court into the afterlife. The Qin dynasty lasted only 15 years, yet it fundamentally transformed Chinese civilization. It proved that the fragmented warring states could be unified under a single administration. It demonstrated the power of standardized systems and centralized control. It showed both the possibilities and the dangers of absolute imperial authority. For the next major dynasty, these lessons proved invaluable. The Han would learn from Qin mistakes while building on Qin foundations, and they would build their capital just south of the ruins of Xianyang, on a site that commanded the same strategic valley where the Zhou had once ruled. The wheel was coming full circle. The Guanzhong Plain would once again become the center of Chinese civilization, but this time the capital would bear a name that meant long-lasting peace. They would call it Chang'an. The Dynasty of Prosperity, Han Zenith, and the Silk Road. In 22 BCE, Liu Bang stood victorious over the ruins of the Qin dynasty. Born a commoner, he had risen through military genius and political acumen to command loyalty from generals and officials alike. Now he faced the question that determined the fate of empires: where to establish his capital. His advisors debated. Some argued for Luoyang in the Central Plains, the old Eastern Zhou capital. It occupied the geographic center of the realm. Roads connected it to all regions, but Liu Bang's strategist Zhang Liang advocated for the Guanzhong region. The past strategy still held, Zhang Liang argued. The mountain-protected valley offered defensive advantages no other location could match. Control the passes, and you controlled an unconquerable base. From there, power could project outward, but enemies struggled to reach inward. Liu Bang chose the Wei River Valley. Just south of ruined Xianyang, workers began constructing a new capital. They called it Chang'an, long-lasting peace. The name proved prophetic. The Han dynasty would endure over 4 centuries, and Chang'an would serve as its magnificent heart for most of that span. The early decades brought consolidation. Liu Bang, now known by his posthumous title Emperor Gaozu, distributed some territories to relatives and generals as semi-autonomous kingdoms. This created immediate problems as these princes grew powerful and rebellious. Subsequent emperors spent decades gradually reducing princely authority and reasserting central control. By the reign of Emperor Jing, the administrative structure had solidified. Then came Emperor Wu. Wu of Han ruled from 141 to 87 BCE, 54 years that transformed the empire. He ascended the throne as a teenager and grew into one of history's most ambitious rulers. Under his direction, Chang'an became not just China's capital, but the center of the known world. Emperor Wu expanded the empire in all directions. His armies pushed south into what is now Vietnam. They campaigned southwest into Yunnan. Most significantly, they drove north and west against the Xiongnu nomadic confederation that had long raided Chinese territories. These campaigns required unprecedented mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched from garrisons across the empire. Supply lines stretched across deserts and mountains. The financial and human costs were enormous, but Wu pressed forward with determination that bordered on obsession. The westward campaigns aimed to outflank the Xiongnu by securing the corridor through Central Asia. This region, later known as the Hexi Corridor, ran between the Mongolian Plateau and the Tibetan highlands. Control it, and China could project power deep into Central Asia while protecting the Guanzhong heartland's western approaches. But Wu needed intelligence. He needed to know what lay beyond the desert, what kingdoms might serve as allies, what routes were passable. In 138 BCE, he dispatched Zhang Xi'an on an embassy to the Yuezhi people, who had fled west after the Xiongnu defeated them. Zhang Qian's mission was to negotiate an alliance, encircle the Xiongnu between Han armies to the east and Yuezhi forces to the west. Zhang Qian never reached the Yuezhi as a free man. Xiongnu warriors captured him early in his journey. He spent 10 years in captivity. He married, had children, and learned the languages and customs of the steppe peoples. Eventually, Zhang Qian escaped. He continued west, finally reaching the Yuezhi in the valley of the Amu Darya River. But the Yuezhi had moved on. They had found fertile lands and showed no interest in fighting their old enemies. Zhang Qian turned back. Xiongnu captured him again. He escaped again. In 126 BCE, 13 years after departing, he stumbled back into Han territory. Of the 100 men who had accompanied him, only 2 survived the journey. But Zhang Qian brought something more valuable than a military alliance. He brought information. He reported on the kingdoms of Central Asia, Daoism with its famous horses, Kangju with its merchants, Bactria with its Hellenistic culture left by Alexander's armies generations before. He described trade routes that connected these lands. He told of a kingdom far to the west called Parthia, and beyond it, mysterious lands that produced fine fabrics and glass. Most intriguingly, he reported that in Bactria he had seen bamboo products and textiles from Shu, the region of southwest China. Trade routes already connected China to Central Asia through intermediaries. What if Han could access those routes directly? Emperor Wu listened and understood. Control the western corridor, secure the trade routes, and Chang'an would become the eastern terminus of a commercial network spanning continents. Wu launched new campaigns. His armies conquered the Hexi corridor and established commanderies there. They pushed further west, defeating Daoism and securing access to its superior horses for cavalry. Garrisons and agricultural colonies secured Han control. By 100 BCE, the routes were opening. Merchants traveled from Chang'an westward through the Hexi corridor, across the Taklamakan Desert via oases like Khotan and Kashgar, over the Pamirs, and into Central Asia. From there, goods passed through Parthian merchants to Roman markets. The Romans called this material that traveled so far sericum. We know it as silk. The Silk Road was born, though no one called it that for another 2,000 years. The term comes from 19th century German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen, but the reality emerged during Emperor Wu's reign, with Chang'an as its eastern anchor. The economic impact transformed the capital. Wealth flowed inward. Merchants arrived from distant kingdoms, their caravans heavy with jade, horses, glassware, and exotic goods. Chang'an's markets offered products from across the known world. The city grew. Population estimates for Han Chang'an range from 250,000 to 400,000 within the walls, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. Suburbs sprawled beyond the walls. Markets, workshops, and residential districts expanded. The layout reflected careful planning. Workers constructed massive walls enclosing roughly 36 square kilometers. The shape was irregular, following the terrain. Within, a grid of major roads organized the space. The imperial palaces occupied the southern portion of the city. The Weiyang Palace served as the primary imperial residence and administrative center. Its audience hall could accommodate 10,000 officials. Multiple pavilions, gardens, and courtyards spread across the palace grounds. Later dynasties would build larger palace complexes, but Weiyang set the standard for imperial grandeur. North of the palaces stretched residential wards, markets, and craft districts. The Eastern market and Western market served different clienteles. The Western market particularly catered to foreign merchants bringing goods along the Silk Road. Chang'an became multicultural. Envoys from dozens of kingdoms maintained residences. Merchants from Central Asia settled permanently. Interpreters facilitated communication. The city absorbed foreign influences while maintaining its Chinese cultural core. The economic boom funded artistic and intellectual flowering. Poets composed verses celebrating the capital's magnificence. Historians compiled records. Craftsmen created works of increasing sophistication in bronze, jade, lacquer, and silk. The city's position made this prosperity possible. The Guanzhong Plains agriculture fed the population. The passes protected it from invasion. The western trade routes brought wealth. The eastern roads connected it to the rest of the empire. But Chang'an was more than an economic hub. It was the center of imperial power. Every morning, officials gathered at the palace for audiences. Decisions made in Weiyang Palace's audience halls determined policies across millions of square kilometers. Appointments to provincial posts, military campaigns, water conservancy projects, tax rates, all emanated from Chang'an. Emperor Wu's long reign established Han supremacy. The Xiongnu threat diminished. The western territories came under control. The empire's borders reached their greatest extent. And Chang'an stood at the center, a magnet drawing people, goods, and ideas from across the known world. The costs were immense. Wu's campaigns drained the treasury. Conscript soldiers died by the thousands in desert campaigns. Taxes burdened the peasantry. Late in his reign, Wu issued a famous edict of self-criticism, acknowledging the suffering his ambitions had caused. But the infrastructure remained. The trade routes stayed open. The empire maintained its territorial gains, and Chang'an continued to prosper. In the generations after Wu, the Han Dynasty continued from its Chang'an base. Emperors came and went, some capable and some weak. Court politics grew complex as relatives of imperial consorts gained power. Factions competed for influence. Yet the system proved resilient. The bureaucracy functioned. The Silk Road continued to bring wealth. The city grew and evolved. New palaces rose, the population swelled, markets expanded. By the end of the 1st century BCE, Chang'an had become the archetype of the Chinese imperial capital. Its layout influenced later dynasties. Its administrative systems became models. Its role as the intersection of political power and commercial wealth defined what a capital should be. The city that began as a strategic decision based on defensive geography had transformed into something greater. It was now the heart of an empire that spanned from the Pacific to Central Asia. It was the eastern terminus of trade routes that connected China to civilizations from Persia to Rome. Zhang Qian's journey had opened a door. Emperor Wu had built the roads. Chang'an stood at the threshold, welcoming the world. The scholarly heart, Han Confucianism and record-keeping. Chang'an housed more than palaces and markets. It became the mind of the empire. The early Han rulers had maintained a pragmatic mixture of governing philosophies. They kept much of the Qin administrative apparatus while softening its harsh edges, but they lacked a unifying ideology to legitimize their rule and bind the empire culturally. Emperor Wu found his answer in Confucianism. The philosophy had existed for 3 centuries by Wu's reign. Confucius himself had lived during the late spring and autumn period, teaching a return to Zhou dynasty values, ritual propriety, filial piety, benevolent governance, and social harmony through proper relationships. His disciples compiled his teachings and spread his ideas. But Confucianism was one philosophy among many. Daoists, legalists, Mohists, and other schools competed for influence. The Qin dynasty had favored legalism with its emphasis on strict law and harsh punishment. Wu changed the equation. In 136 BCE, he established Confucianism as the official state ideology. This didn't mean abandoning practical legalist administrative methods. Rather, it meant coding those methods in Confucian language and creating a Confucian-educated bureaucracy. The emperor founded the Imperial Academy, the Taishui, in Chang'an. It began modestly with 50 students studying the Confucian classics under appointed scholars. Over time, it expanded dramatically. By the late Han period, the academy enrolled over 30,000 students. The curriculum focused on the five classics: the Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, the Book of Rites, the Book of Changes, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. Students memorized these texts, studied their interpretations, and learned to write essays in classical style. This created a new path to power. Previously, positions came through military achievement or birth. Now, mastery of classical texts could lead to government appointment. The examination system that would dominate Chinese administration for 2 millennia began to take shape here in Han Chang'an. The Imperial Academy sat in the northeast part of the city. Students lived in dormitories near their lecture halls. They attended lectures by the five classics erudites, scholars appointed by the emperor to teach and preserve textual traditions. Debates over interpretation became serious business. Different schools emerged, each claiming authentic understanding of the classics. The Old Text school claimed to preserve ancient versions hidden during the Qin book burnings. The New Text school worked with reconstructed texts using contemporary script. These scholarly disputes might seem abstract, but they carried political weight. Interpretation of the classics informed policy decisions. Did the Book of Documents support aggressive expansion or peaceful consolidation? Did ritual texts require elaborate court ceremonies or simpler observances? Emperors and ministers turned to classical precedent to justify their choices. The concentration of scholars in Chang'an made it a center for intellectual production. Commentaries on the classics multiplied. New texts appeared, often claiming ancient pedigree. The city's libraries accumulated vast collections. The most important intellectual achievement of this period came from one man, Sima Qian. Born around 145 BCE, Sima Qian inherited his father's position as grand astrologer. This office involved much more than astronomy. It included maintaining historical records, advising on auspicious dates, and preserving the imperial library. Sima Qian's father had begun compiling a comprehensive history of China, from legendary times to the present. On his deathbed, he made his son promise to complete the work. Sima Qian dedicated himself to the task. He traveled across the empire, interviewing witnesses and examining local records. He studied documents in the imperial archives. He wrestled with how to organize millennia of history into a coherent narrative. In 99 BCE, disaster struck. A general whom Sima Qian had defended at court suffered a military defeat. Emperor Wu, enraged, looked to punish anyone associated with the general. Sima Qian faced execution. He had two alternatives: pay an enormous fine that he couldn't afford, or accept castration. For a Confucian scholar, castration represented profound humiliation. It violated the body received from one's parents and prevented carrying on the family line. Many chose death over such shame. Sima Qian chose to live. He accepted castration so he could complete his father's work. He spent the next decade finishing the records of the grand historian, known in Chinese as the Shiji. The work spanned 130 chapters, covering over 2,000 years of Chinese history, from the legendary Yellow Emperor to Emperor Wu's reign. But Sima Qian did more than chronicle events. He invented a new historiographical structure. Rather than simple chronological narrative, he organized the work into 5 categories: basic annals of rulers, chronological tables, treatises on topics like rituals and economics, hereditary houses of notable families, and biographies of significant individuals. This structure allowed him to present history from multiple perspectives. The same events appeared in different chapters, seen through different eyes. He included biographies of merchants, assassins, and court jesters alongside generals and ministers. Most remarkably, he wrote with moral judgment and literary artistry. He praised virtue and condemned corruption regardless of rank. He included himself in the work, explaining his methodology and the suffering that led to the book's completion. His prose ranged from spare chronicle to elaborate narrative. The Shiji became the model for all subsequent Chinese historical writing. Dynasty after dynasty produced official histories following Sima Qian's structural template. His work demonstrated that history was not just a record of events, but a moral teacher and literary art form. The book circulated among Chang'an's educated elite. Copies spread across the empire. Future historians built on his foundation, often working in the capital where access to documents and fellow scholars was greatest. Chang'an accumulated knowledge. The imperial library held hundreds of thousands of bamboo and silk texts. Scholars cataloged them, organized them, and wrote new works building on them. The philosopher Dong Zhongshu, who had advised Emperor Wu on adopting Confucianism, developed an elaborate cosmological system connecting human society to natural phenomena. When rulers governed virtuously, nature responded with favorable signs. Misconduct produced disasters. This theory reinforced the mandate of heaven concept while giving it a Confucian interpretation. It also made record-keeping crucial. Officials noted unusual natural phenomena, comets, earthquakes, eclipses, as potential evidence of heaven's judgment. The bureaucracy grew increasingly sophisticated. Detailed regulations governed official conduct. Standardized forms recorded everything from tax collection to criminal cases. Reports flowed from provinces to the capital, where ministries reviewed them. The capital's administrative offices employed thousands of clerks, copyists, and low-ranking officials. They worked in buildings near the palace, creating and maintaining the documentary record that allowed the empire to function. Legal codes combined legalist precision with Confucian values. Harsh punishments remained for serious crimes, but judges considered motives and circumstances. Filial piety became a legal principle. Someone who harmed their parents faced severer punishment than for the same act against a stranger. Conversely, children could not testify against parents. The examination system remained informal during the Han, but its foundations were laid. Officials recommended talented individuals for appointment. These candidates needed education in the classics. Increasingly, that education came from the Imperial Academy in Chang'an. The city thus functioned as a filter and processor of the empire's intellectual life. Scholars came to study, hopefully gain appointments, and contribute to the growing body of classical interpretation. The brightest students might eventually become high officials, carrying their Chang'an education to provincial posts. This created a shared culture among the ruling class. Officials across the empire had studied the same texts, learned the same values, and absorbed the same worldview. When they corresponded or met, they shared a common language rooted in classical learning. The concentration of knowledge in Chang'an made it vulnerable. When chaos came, the loss of the capital meant loss of irreplaceable texts. But during the Han's prosperous centuries, this concentration enabled unprecedented intellectual synthesis. Scholars compared texts, reconciled contradictions, and developed comprehensive interpretations. The isolation that had once separated regional traditions broke down. A unified classical heritage emerged, codified in the curriculum of the Imperial Academy. Religious and philosophical synthesis occurred alongside textual scholarship. Confucianism absorbed elements from other traditions. Ritual practices that originated in ancient shamanism received Confucian interpretation. Taoist concepts of natural harmony merged with Confucian social ethics. The result was not pure Confucianism, as the master had taught it, but a new hybrid suited to imperial administration. It emphasized hierarchy, order, education, and moral leadership. It provided legitimacy for the emperor as the cosmic center of human society. It justified the bureaucracy as rule by the educated and virtuous. This ideology would outlast the Han Dynasty. It would survive periods of disunion and foreign conquest. It would shape Chinese civilization for 2 millennia. And it crystallized in Chang'an during the Han centuries, when the Imperial Academy trained officials, when Sima Xi'an wrote history as moral teaching, and when scholars gathered to debate the meaning of ancient texts. The city of markets and armies was also a city of books and ideas. The traders on the Silk Road brought material wealth. The scholars in the academies created intellectual capital that proved equally valuable and far more enduring. An age of disunion, turmoil, and transformation. The later Han Dynasty moved its capital east to Luoyang in 25 CE after a brief usurpation. Chang'an remained an important regional center, but it no longer commanded the empire. Then came collapse. The Han Dynasty's final decades brought court intrigue, eunuch power, and rebellions. The Yellow Turban Rebellion in 1884 CE shook the empire. Regional warlords raised armies. In 990 CE, the tyrant Dongzhuo captured Luoyang and briefly moved the imperial court back to Chang'an. Dongzhuo's occupation brutalized the city. He burned Luoyang behind him, forcibly relocated the population, and constructed elaborate fortifications around Chang'an. His brief reign ended with assassination in 192 CE. His successors fought each other while the captive emperor watched helplessly. In 995 CE, the warlord coalition finally drove Dongzhuo's faction from Chang'an. The city fell into chaos. Soldiers looted, buildings burned, the population scattered. The Han Dynasty limped along until 220 CE when it finally fragmented. Three kingdoms emerged, each claiming legitimacy. Wei in the north, Shuhan in the southwest, and Wu in the southeast. None controlled Chang'an. The city that had been the capital of a unified empire became a prize in regional conflicts. The Wei dynasty briefly made it a secondary capital. Then came the Jin dynasty's temporary reunification, followed by fresh disintegration. The period from 220 to 589 CE, nearly 4 centuries, saw China fracture into competing dynasties, many led by non-Han peoples from beyond the traditional borders. Historians call this the period of disunion, or the Six Dynasties period, though the nomenclature varies depending on how you count. Chang'an suffered through this chaos but remained significant. Its location in the defensible Guanzhong Basin made it valuable. Whoever controlled the passes controlled a fortress. The former Zhao dynasty, founded by Lu Yuan of Xiongnu descent, made Chang'an its capital in 311 CE. This marked a profound shift. For the first time, a ruler of nomadic heritage commanded China's traditional imperial seat. The former Zhao's control lasted only until 329 CE, when the later Zhao dynasty conquered them. Chang'an changed hands repeatedly over the following decades. The former Qin dynasty made it their capital and briefly reunified northern China in the 350s to 380s. Then came the later Qin, the western Wei, and the northern Zhou. Each dynasty rebuilt portions of the city. Each added their own architectural signatures. The urban landscape became a palimpsest of competing visions. These non-Han dynasties, often labeled the 16 Kingdoms, brought cultural complexity. Xiongnu, Xianbei, Di, Qiang, and other peoples had their own traditions, but they recognized Chang'an's prestige. Ruling from the ancient Zhou and Han capital conferred legitimacy. This produced remarkable cultural synthesis. Non-Han rulers adopted Chinese administrative practices. They patronized Confucian scholars. They conducted traditional imperial rituals, but they also maintained their own languages and customs. The city became multilingual. Xianbei and other northern languages mixed with Chinese dialects. Scribes recorded documents in multiple scripts. Translators facilitated communication. Most significantly, Buddhism spread. Buddhist monks had begun arriving in China during the later Han period via the Silk Road. Initially, Buddhism attracted limited interest, seen as an exotic foreign teaching. But during the period of disunion, it flourished. Several factors drove this. The chaos and suffering made people receptive to Buddhism's message about the nature of suffering and the path to liberation. Non-Han rulers, unfamiliar with Confucian orthodoxy, found Buddhism appealing. The religion transcended ethnic divisions. A Han Chinese and a Xianbei warrior could both be Buddhists. Chang'an became a major center for Buddhist translation and teaching. Monks arrived from Central Asia and India. They brought Sanskrit texts and set about translating them into Chinese. Kumarjiva, a monk from Kucha in modern Xinjiang, arrived in Chang'an in 401 CE under the patronage of the later Qin ruler. He established translation bureaus where teams of monks worked systematically to render Buddhist scriptures into elegant Chinese. Kumarajiva's translations proved decisive. Earlier attempts had been clumsy, using Daoist terminology that distorted Buddhist concepts. Kumarajiva created new vocabulary and found Chinese expressions that better conveyed the original meaning. Under his direction, translators produced Chinese versions of key Mahayana texts. The Diamond Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, and the Vimalakirti Sutra entered Chinese culture through his work. These translations shaped how East Asian Buddhism would develop. Temples rose across Chang'an. The ruling dynasties sponsored their construction. Monks received land and tax exemptions. Monasteries accumulated wealth and influence. Buddhist art arrived along the Silk Road. Sculptors created images of the Buddha in Gandharan, Central Asian, and increasingly Chinese styles. Cave temples in the regions around Chang'an displayed evolving artistic forms. This religious transformation occurred alongside political fragmentation. The very instability that made the period chaotic also opened space for cultural experimentation. Without a stable unified court enforcing orthodoxy, diverse ideas circulated freely. Daoism also evolved during this period. Taoist philosophers and alchemists had long pursued immortality and harmony with cosmic forces. Now they organized into formal institutions that mirrored Buddhist monasticism. Taoist temples and priesthoods emerged. The three teachings, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, existed in tension and exchange. Scholars debated their respective merits. Some sought synthesis. Others argued for the superiority of their tradition. But in Chang'an and across China, people increasingly practiced elements of all three. They maintained Confucian family rituals, consulted Taoist priests about health and fortune, and visited Buddhist temples to pray for deceased relatives. The city's architecture reflected this diversity. Confucian temples for ancestor worship, Taoist shrines, and Buddhist monasteries coexisted, each added to Chang'an's landscape. The period of disunion also saw important technological and economic developments. Improved agricultural techniques spread. New crops arrived along the Silk Road. Trade continued despite political fragmentation. The stirrup reached China during this period, revolutionizing cavalry warfare. Heavy cavalry with armored riders on stirrup-equipped horses became decisive in battle. This military innovation came from the northern peoples and their interaction with Central Asian cultures. Artistic styles evolved. The rigid formality of Han art gave way to more naturalistic representation. Landscape painting emerged as a distinct genre. Calligraphy developed as a high art form with different scripts expressing different aesthetics. Literary forms diversified. The 5-character and 7-character regulated verse forms that would dominate Tang poetry began to take shape. Writers experimented with new expressions and themes. Through all this change, Chang'an endured. Its population fluctuated with each war and change of dynasty. Parts of the city fell into ruins while other areas were rebuilt. The walls required constant repair, but the location remained strategic. The Guanzhong Basin still offered agricultural surplus and defensive strength. Whoever unified northern China would likely choose Chang'an as their capital. In 577 CE, the Northern Zhou dynasty conquered its rival, the Northern Qi, unifying northern China. The Zhou ruled from Chang'an, but their time was short. In 581 CE, a general named Yang Jian seized power and founded the Sui dynasty. From Chang'an, he began planning the reunification of all China. The south remained independent under the Chen dynasty, but not for long. In 589 CE, Sui armies conquered the south. For the first time in nearly 4 centuries, one dynasty ruled the entire realm. The period of disunion had ended. A new age of unity dawned, and once again, Chang'an would stand at its center. The 4 centuries of division had transformed Chinese culture. Buddhism had become integral to Chinese life. Non-Han peoples had become part of the cultural mix. New literary and artistic forms had emerged. The rigid Han orthodoxy had loosened, allowing creativity. This would all bear fruit in the coming dynasty. The Tang would inherit the cultural riches accumulated during the period of disunion. They would synthesize disparate elements into a new golden age. But first, the Sui had work to do. The city needed reconstruction, the empire needed consolidation, and a new capital needed to rise that would surpass anything that had come before. Chang'an was about to enter its most magnificent phase. The cosmic city, grandeur of Tang urban planning. The Sui dynasty unified China but overreached. Its ambitious projects, the Grand Canal, palace construction, disastrous Korean campaigns, drained resources and sparked rebellion. In 618 CE, after only 37 years, the Sui collapsed. Li Yuan, a general of mixed Han and Xi'an descent, seized Chang'an and declared a new dynasty. He called it Tang. The Tang dynasty would last nearly 3 centuries. Under its rule, Chang'an would reach its zenith as the greatest planned city in the world. But the Tang didn't inherit a functioning capital. The Sui had begun constructing a new city slightly southeast of the Han ruins, calling it Daxing. Emperor Wen of Sui had commissioned the architect Yuan Kai to design a capital worthy of reunified China. The Tang emperors adopted and expanded this plan. They renamed the city Chang'an, reclaiming the glorious name. Then they set about creating an urban space that embodied cosmic order. The scale was staggering. The outer walls enclosed roughly 87 square kilometers, making Chang'an the largest city in the world at the time. The population would eventually reach around 1 million within the walls, with perhaps another million in the suburbs. The shape formed a rectangle running north-south longer than east-west. Walls of rammed earth rose 5.5 meters high and 10 meters thick at the base. 18 gates pierced these walls, 3 on each side except the north, which had 3 closely spaced gates. Architects laid out a perfect grid of 11 north-south avenues and 14 east-west avenues. These divided the city into 108 wards called Fang, plus 2 market districts. The widest avenue, Zhuquei Street, ran from the central southern gate straight north to the palace. At 155 meters wide, it was designed to impress visitors approaching from the south. Trees lined both sides. A drainage canal ran down the center. Each ward was a walled enclosure with 4 gates that closed at night. Within the ward walls, smaller streets created a subgrid. Residential plots, temples, and shops filled the interior. Guards patrolled to enforce curfew. This created a city that was simultaneously open and controlled. The grand avenues allowed movement and ceremony. The walled wards enabled surveillance and order. The design reflected a philosophy. Urban space should embody hierarchy and regulation, just as society should. The imperial city occupied the north-central section. Walls separated it from the rest of Chang'an. Within this enclosure sat government offices, reception halls, and ceremonial spaces. North of the imperial city rose the palace city, the emperor's residential quarters and private domain. The massive Taiji Palace served early Tang emperors as their primary residence. Multiple halls, pavilions, gardens, and artificial lakes filled the grounds. Later, Tang emperors constructed the Daming Palace northeast of the main palace complex. This became the primary imperial residence for most of the dynasty. At over 3.2 square kilometers, it was a city within a city. The Daming Palace's main audience hall, the Hanyuan Hall, stood on a raised platform overlooking a vast courtyard. Foreign envoys and assembled officials gathered below while the emperor sat elevated above them. The symbolism was explicit. The Son of Heaven occupied the supreme position, with humanity arrayed beneath. The palace complex included residential quarters for the emperor's family, offices for high officials, armories, stables, and extensive gardens. The Taiyi Pool, an artificial lake, offered pleasure cruises and elaborate water entertainments. Building such structures required enormous resources. Workers quarried stone from mountains kilometers away. They transported massive timbers from distant forests. Craftsmen created glazed tiles, carved decorations, and painted elaborate designs. The 2 markets, east and west, occupied full ward spaces. The West Market, closer to the Silk Road terminus, specialized in foreign goods. Merchants from Central Asia, Persia, and beyond operated shops and warehouses. You could buy Arabian horses, Persian glassware, Indian gems, or Southeast Asian spices. The East Market served the domestic population with everyday necessities. Food stalls, cloth merchants, toolmakers, and countless other trades operated in designated sections. Officials supervised commerce, collected taxes, and maintained order. Both markets operated on schedules marked by drum beats. Opening drums sounded at dawn. Closing drums at dusk signaled merchants to shut down. Anyone remaining in the market after closing faced penalties. The city's infrastructure impressed contemporaries. A sophisticated water system brought water from springs and rivers through channels and pipes. Wells supplemented the supply. Drainage channels removed wastewater, though sewage disposal remained a challenge in such a dense population. Major roads featured drainage ditches on both sides. Trees provided shade. Some accounts describe willows and scholar trees lining the avenues, though archaeological evidence is fragmentary. The city walls required constant maintenance. Rains eroded the rammed earth. Defenders patrolled the ramparts. Gates remained guarded day and night, with identity checks for those entering. Beyond the walls sprawled extensive suburbs, particularly to the south and east. The Qijiangpan Pleasure Park attracted aristocrats and scholars. Temples and monasteries occupied areas outside the walls. The Xi'an Temple to the southeast housed the giant wild goose pagoda, built to store Buddhist scriptures brought from India. The layout reflected cosmological principles derived from both Confucian ritual texts and Buddhist mandala concepts. The emperor's position in the north mirrored the pole star around which heaven revolves. The ordered grid represented human society properly arranged. The walls symbolized the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. This wasn't merely functional planning, it was philosophy made visible. Walking through Chang'an meant moving through a map of the cosmos with everything in its proper place according to both social hierarchy and cosmic harmony. The gate names encoded meaning. The main southern gate was called Mingde, brilliant virtue. Others referenced Confucian values or auspicious imagery. Names reminded residents that they inhabited an ideologically charged space. Different wards housed different social classes. High officials occupied wards near the palace. Wealthy merchants inhabited wards near the markets. Craftsmen and workers lived in more distant wards. This geographic sorting reinforced social stratification. Yet the city also allowed mixing. Markets brought together all classes. Religious festivals opened temples to crowds. The major avenues hosted processions where commoners could glimpse imperial spectacle. The architecture within the wards varied enormously. Mansions of the wealthy featured elaborate gardens with artificial hills, ponds, and imported plants. Middle-class homes were more modest but still substantial. The poor crowded into small dwellings, sometimes multiple families sharing one building. Temples added diversity to the urban landscape. Buddhist monasteries, Taoist temples, and Confucian shrines each brought distinctive architectural styles. Buddhist temples featured Indian-influenced stupas transformed into Chinese pagodas. Taoist temples incorporated natural elements and flowing designs. Confucian temples emphasized symmetry and restraint. The city evolved constantly. Buildings burned and were rebuilt. Emperors commissioned new palaces. Wealthy families constructed mansions. Temples expanded. The archaeological record shows layers of construction, destruction, and reconstruction throughout the Tang period. Yet the basic grid pattern remained stable. The major avenues never shifted. The palace stayed in the north. The markets maintained their positions. This underlying order provided continuity despite surface changes. Foreign visitors marveled at Chang'an. Japanese monks returning from study visits wrote descriptions that influenced Japanese capital planning. Nara and later Kyoto adopted modified versions of Chang'an's grid layout. Korean capitals showed similar influence. The city represented the pinnacle of Tang power and ambition. It was a statement. This is what a civilization at its height can achieve. Order, grandeur, and cosmic harmony made manifest in streets, walls, and palaces. But creating this ordered space required control. The ward system enabled surveillance. Neighborhood heads reported to officials. Strangers attracted attention. The curfew enforced nightly discipline. This tension between openness and control, between cosmopolitan mixing and hierarchical order, defined Tang Chang'an. The city welcomed the world but regulated who went where and when. It celebrated culture and commerce while maintaining strict social divisions. The physical city embodied Tang ideology. A properly ordered society required properly ordered space. The emperor's position in the north corresponded to his cosmic role. The walls separated civilization from chaos. The grid organized humanity as ritual texts organized behavior. Walking those wide avenues, past the walled wards toward the towering palaces in the north, residents and visitors alike experienced a message. This is the center of the world, where heaven's mandate is made real in earth and stone. The planning that created this urban masterpiece took decades. Maintaining it required constant effort, but the result was a city that contemporaries recognized as supreme. Chang'an in the early and mid-Tang period was not just China's capital. It was the imperial city par excellence, the standard against which all other cities were measured. And into this magnificent planned space poured the people who would make it truly great. The gate of all nations, Tang cosmopolitanism. The Japanese monk Enin arrived in Chang'an in 840 CE. He spent years in the city studying Buddhism. His detailed diary recorded prices in markets, conversations with other foreign monks, imperial ceremonies he witnessed, and the astonishing diversity of people crowding the streets. Enin was one of countless foreign visitors who made Tang Chang'an the most cosmopolitan city on earth. The Silk Road channeled humanity from across Asia into the capital. Merchants from Sogdiana, a Central Asian Iranian culture, maintained a particularly strong presence. They controlled much of the overland trade, operating commercial networks that stretched from Chang'an to the Mediterranean. These Sogdian merchants settled in Chang'an, establishing neighborhoods in certain wards. They built temples for their faith, Zoroastrianism, which recognized Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity locked in cosmic struggle against evil. Fire temples maintained sacred flames. Priests conducted rituals in Old Persian. The Tang government officially recognized Zoroastrianism as a legitimate religion, calling it the religion of the heavenly Lord. This pragmatic tolerance allowed the court to maintain good relations with the Sogdian commercial networks that facilitated trade. Other foreign religions found homes in Chang'an. Nestorian Christianity, a branch that had separated from mainstream Christianity over theological disputes in the 5th century, established a presence. The famous Nestorian stele, erected in 781 CE, recorded the faith's arrival in China in 635 CE and its subsequent imperial patronage. The stele still exists, housed in Xi'an's Forest of Stone Steles Museum. Its text, written in Chinese with Syriac annotations, describes Christian doctrine in Buddhist and Daoist terminology. This linguistic adaptation exemplified how foreign religions translated themselves into Chinese concepts. Manichaeism, a dualist faith founded by the prophet Mani in 3rd century Persia, also reached Chang'an. Initially tolerated, it later faced suppression along with other foreign religions during xenophobic periods. But for much of the Tang era, Manichaean temples operated in the capital. Islam arrived late in the Tang period, but established a lasting presence. Arab and Persian Muslim merchants traveled the maritime routes to southern Chinese ports, but some ventured overland to Chang'an. The city's first mosque may date to the Tang era, though the evidence is debated. This religious diversity created a marketplace of ideas. Theological debates occurred. Texts circulated. People converted between faiths or practiced syncretistic combinations. Buddhism remained the most influential foreign religion. By the Tang period, it had been in China for centuries and had thoroughly Sinicized. Multiple schools of Buddhist thought competed for adherence and patronage. The Xi'an temple in southeast Chang'an became particularly famous. The monk Xuanzang, who had traveled to India and returned with hundreds of Buddhist texts, worked there translating Sanskrit scriptures into Chinese. Xuanzang's journey became legendary. He had left Chang'an in 629 CE without official permission, crossing deserts and mountains to reach India. He studied at Buddhist centers, debated with scholars, and collected texts. His return in 645 CE was triumphant. Emperor Taizong welcomed him, provided imperial support for his translation work, and built the giant wild goose pagoda to house the scriptures he brought back. The pagoda still stands, one of Xi'an's most famous landmarks. Its 7 stories rise 64 meters. Tang-era brick construction has survived earthquakes and wars. Inside, Xuanzang established his translation bureau. Teams of monks worked with him. Some knew Sanskrit, others specialized in Chinese literary style. They debated terminology and checked translations against multiple versions. The process aimed for both accuracy to the original and elegance in Chinese. This scholarly work attracted monks from across Asia. Korean and Japanese monastics came to study. Central Asian monks offered expertise in Sanskrit. Vietnamese Buddhists made pilgrimages. Chang'an became a node in an international Buddhist network. The city's markets reflected its cosmopolitan character. The West Market bustled with foreign merchants. Contemporary poetry describes Persian shops, Arabian bazaars, and Central Asian wine houses. Foreign fashions influenced Tang taste. Women adopted clothing styles from Central Asia, wearing fitted jackets and riding boots. Playing polo, a sport from Persia, became popular among the aristocracy. Foreign musical instruments, lutes, drums, and flutes from Central Asia enriched Chinese music. Food cultures mixed. Grapes and wine from the western regions became fashionable. Spices from India seasoned dishes. Recipes incorporated foreign ingredients and techniques. The Tang court employed foreign musicians, dancers, and entertainers. Orchestras included instruments and styles from multiple traditions. Dance performances drew on Central Asian traditions. At banquets, foreign performers displayed their arts. This cosmopolitan culture had political dimensions. The Tang emperors portrayed themselves as universal rulers, not merely Chinese sovereigns. The title Tian Ke Han, Heavenly Kagan, indicated their claim to rule both Chinese and Central Asian peoples. Foreign envoys regularly visited Chang'an to present tribute and conduct diplomacy. The tribute system, while often portrayed as purely hierarchical, actually facilitated trade and diplomatic exchange. Foreign rulers sent embassies that combined diplomatic recognition with commercial opportunity. These embassies brought exotic gifts: lions from Central Asia, ostriches from Arabia, dancers from India. The Tang court received them in elaborate ceremonies designed to display imperial magnificence and hospitality. Embassy quarters in certain wards housed foreign diplomats during extended stays. Translators and protocol officials managed the complex interactions between the court and foreign representatives. The Tang Legal Code addressed foreign residents. Special provisions applied to cases involving foreigners. Different ethnic groups could sometimes follow their own laws in internal matters, though serious crimes fell under Tang jurisdiction. This created a complex legal landscape. A dispute between two Sogdians might be adjudicated according to Sogdian custom, but a Sogdian and a Chinese person would be judged under Tang law. Officials required knowledge of various cultural practices to navigate these situations. Intermarriage occurred, particularly between Chinese men and foreign women. Some foreign merchants settled permanently, married Chinese wives, and raised families. Their descendants assimilated over generations, though some maintained distinct identities. The cosmopolitan atmosphere sparked creativity. Chinese poets borrowed images from foreign cultures. Painters depicted scenes from foreign lands. The famous Tang three-color glazed pottery often featured foreign figures: merchants, grooms, musicians, and warriors from Central Asia. These ceramic figures discovered in Tang tombs show how foreign peoples were perceived. Some depictions verge on caricature, but they also reveal familiarity. The artists knew foreign features, clothing, and props well enough to render them accurately. Trade goods moved through Chang'an in vast quantities. Silk flowed outward. Glass, precious stones, and metals flowed inward. The economic impact enriched merchants and generated tax revenue. The government established trade protocols. Designated officials supervised foreign merchants. Customs inspections occurred at entry points. Records tracked goods for taxation purposes. Yet the system remained porous. Smuggling occurred. Unofficial trade happened alongside official commerce. The long Silk Road provided many opportunities to evade oversight. Foreign soldiers served in Tang armies. The dynasty recruited cavalry from Central Asian peoples renowned for horsemanship. Some foreign generals reached high military rank. And Xi'an himself, whose rebellion would devastate the empire, was of Sogdian and Turkic descent. This military multiculturalism provided advantages but also risks. Foreign troops brought specialized skills, but their loyalty could be uncertain. Frontier generals with foreign connections might pursue independent interests. The cosmopolitan culture peaked in the early and mid-Tang. The city's population may have included 100,000 or more foreign residents at its height, perhaps 10% of the total. Walking through Tang Chang'an, you would hear multiple languages: Sogdian, Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, Korean, Japanese, Tibetan, Turkic languages, all mixed with various Chinese dialects. Neighborhoods developed distinct characters based on predominant ethnic groups. Religious festivals added to the diversity. Buddhist processions on the Buddha's birthday filled the streets. Zoroastrian celebrations honored the fire. Nestorian Christians observed their calendar. Taoist festivals invoked Chinese deities. Confucian rituals marked seasonal transitions. This tolerance had limits. When the Tang court felt threatened, it could turn xenophobic. Later Tang emperors would persecute foreign religions. The great anti-Buddhist persecution of 845 CE targeted Buddhism as a foreign faith that drained resources from the state. But during the cosmopolitan peak, Chang'an exemplified cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. The city functioned as a meeting point for Eurasia. Ideas, goods, genes, technologies, and artistic styles mixed and recombined. Scholars debate how deeply this cosmopolitanism penetrated Chinese culture. Some argue it remained superficial, a veneer over fundamentally Chinese civilization. Others see profound transformation, with foreign influences reshaping everything from food to philosophy. The truth likely lies between extremes. Chinese culture maintained its core identity, but it selectively adopted foreign elements, adapting them to Chinese contexts. The result was neither purely Chinese nor simply foreign, but a creative synthesis. This was Chang'an's gift to Chinese civilization, the demonstration that cultural confidence could coexist with openness. A society secure in its identity could welcome foreign influences without losing itself. The cosmopolitan experiment would not last forever. Crisis would bring retrenchment. But for those glorious decades, Chang'an stood as proof that a great city could embrace the world. The Son of Heaven, imperial power, and courtly life. The Taiji Palace's main audience hall filled with officials before dawn. They arranged themselves by rank in precise formations. Silence reigned, drums sounded. The emperor entered and ascended the throne. Officials prostrated themselves. The morning audience began. This daily ritual demonstrated the emperor's position as the axis of the empire. Every decision, every appointment, every policy originated from his authority. The elaborate court ceremonies reinforced this message constantly. Emperor Taizong, who ruled from 626 to 649 CE, exemplified effective imperial power. He had seized the throne from his father through violence. His brothers died in the coup, but he governed with remarkable competence. Taizong attracted talented officials regardless of their backgrounds. He famously stated that he used defeated enemies as advisors because they understood opposition perspectives. His minister Wei Zheng regularly criticized him to his face, and Taizong valued the honest counsel. The emperor rose early and worked long hours reviewing documents. Officials submitted memorials, formal written arguments on policy matters. Taizong read these carefully, annotated them, and issued responses. The bureaucracy generated mountains of paperwork that required imperial attention. Court audiences occurred multiple times daily. Morning audiences addressed routine business. Special audiences considered major policy decisions. The emperor received foreign embassies in elaborate ceremonies. He consulted his top ministers in smaller meetings. The physical setting reinforced imperial authority. The emperor sat elevated on a throne. Officials stood below in hierarchical positions. Everything from clothing colors to position in the hall indicated rank. Court dress followed strict regulations. The emperor wore yellow, a color reserved exclusively for him. High officials wore purple or red. Lower ranks wore blue or green. Hats, belts, and ornaments signaled status at a glance. The ceremonies contained centuries of accumulated meaning. Every gesture had been codified. Ritual texts prescribed precise movements, words, and timing. Court ritual officials ensured correct performance. This attention to ceremonial detail wasn't empty formalism. It expressed Confucian principles about order and hierarchy. Proper ritual demonstrated moral cultivation. Violations signaled disorder. Behind the formal audiences lay the inner palace, where the emperor's personal life unfolded. The harem housed hundreds of women, the emperor's wife, consorts, concubines, and servants. The empress held supreme status among women. She conducted her own ceremonial functions. She managed the harem hierarchy. She bore children who might inherit the throne. But empresses could be dangerous. Through their families, they accessed political power. A strong empress's relatives might dominate the court. Several periods of Tang history saw effective rule by empress or their clans. Wu Zetian represented the extreme case. Beginning as a concubine to Emperor Taizong, she became empress to his son. Eventually, she declared herself emperor in her own right, the only woman to hold that title in Chinese history. Wu Zetian's reign from 690 to 705 CE remains controversial. She promoted Buddhism over Confucianism. She elevated officials based on talent rather than birth. She ruthlessly eliminated rivals, but she also maintained stability and expanded the empire. Her unprecedented power came partly from understanding court politics. She built networks of loyal officials. She used intelligence services to monitor potential threats. She manipulated succession to remove obstacles. The harem system created constant intrigue. Consorts competed for the emperor's attention and favor. Producing sons improved a consort's status. The mother of the crown prince might become empress dowager with enormous influence. Eunuchs managed the inner palace. These castrated men could enter women's quarters and served as intermediaries between the emperor and the outside world. Some eunuchs gained enormous power by controlling access to the emperor. Later Tang history saw eunuch domination of the court. They manipulated weak emperors, arranged assassinations, and effectively controlled policy. This institutional weakness would contribute to the dynasty's decline. Emperor Xuanzong's reign from 712 to 756 CE marked the dynasty's peak and the beginning of its decline. His early decades brought competent administration and cultural fluorescence. He was personally talented in music and attracted brilliant officials, but his late reign deteriorated into disaster. His obsession with the concubine Yang Guifei distracted him from governance. He elevated her relatives to high positions regardless of merit. He trusted the general on Lushan unwisely. The palace became a stage for luxury and entertainment. Xuanzang composed music and sponsored performances. Yang Guifei danced. Poets recited verses. The court consumed vast resources on pleasure. The Daming Palace, where Xuanzang spent most of his time, contained elaborate gardens and pavilions designed for entertainment. The Taiye Pool hosted boat parties. Artificial mountains created scenic views. The palace grounds employed thousands of servants, guards, and craftsmen. Feeding the palace population required enormous supply networks. Grain arrived from across the empire via the Grand Canal. Specialty foods came from distant provinces. The logistics of palace provisioning engaged entire bureaucracies. Palace kitchens prepared elaborate meals for the emperor. Cooks specialized in different cuisines. Food tasters checked for poison. Specific vessels and utensils marked the hierarchy of diners. The emperor's daily life combined rigid ritual with luxurious comfort. He woke to officials announcing the hour. Attendants dressed him according to the day's ceremonial requirements. He ate meals prepared to exacting standards. He received reports and issued orders. He spent evenings with consorts or entertainers. But he was never alone. Servants surrounded him constantly. Bodyguards secured every space. Officials tracked his movements. Privacy was impossible. This gilded cage produced various responses. Some emperors worked diligently, finding meaning in governance. Others retreated into pleasure-seeking, letting ministers handle actual administration. A few went mad from the pressure and isolation. The succession system created instability. The eldest son of the empress should inherit, but reality was more complex. Emperors might favor younger sons. Powerful consorts promoted their own children. Officials factioned around different princes. Crown princes faced dangerous positions. If the emperor tired of his heir, designation could be withdrawn. Ambitious brothers plotted against each other. Some crown princes faced execution for alleged treason. Emperor Taizong himself had eliminated his brothers to seize power. This violent precedent haunted Tang's succession. Several subsequent emperors faced rebellions from relatives. The throne sometimes passed through assassination. The court maintained elaborate intelligence networks. Officials reported on each other. Secret memorials informed the emperor of private conversations. The censorate investigated corruption and disloyalty. This surveillance cut both ways. While it helped emperors control officials, it also created a climate of suspicion and paranoia. Officials crafted their statements carefully. Private thoughts remained hidden. Trust became rare. Yet the system functioned for over a century before Comperfler, and Lushan's rebellion shattered it. During that period, Tang emperors presided over the most sophisticated administrative machine in the world. Ministries specialized in revenue, rights, war, justice, personnel, and public works. Each ministry employed hundreds of officials, organized in hierarchies. Documents flowed up for decisions and down as orders. The examination system recruited officials from across the empire. Candidates studied for years. They traveled to Chang'an for tests. Successful examinees received appointments. This meritocratic element tempered hereditary privilege. High officials often came from aristocratic families with traditions of service. But examination success could elevate men from modest backgrounds. The system created a scholar official class bound by shared education and values. These officials owed their positions ultimately to the emperor. He appointed them. He promoted or demoted them. He could execute them for treason. Their careers depended on imperial favor. But good emperors recognized their dependence on skilled administrators. Taizong famously compared ministers to mirrors that showed him his flaws. Without honest advisors, an emperor became isolated and made poor decisions. The balance between imperial power and bureaucratic expertise remained delicate. Strong emperors dominated their courts. Weak emperors became puppets. The best periods saw collaboration between capable emperors and talented ministers. Palace life combined intense formality with personal luxury. The emperor wore simple clothes in private quarters, but elaborate robes for ceremonies. He ate simply or lavishly depending on the occasion. He could summon any entertainment but never escaped his role. The palace grounds contained theaters where troops performed. Libraries held thousands of texts. Gardens offered respite from court pressures. Workshops produced luxury goods for imperial use. Everything touched by the emperor carried symbolic weight. His calligraphy was treasured, his poetry was collected, his casual remarks were recorded. The bureaucracy documented imperial life exhaustively. This documentation now provides historians with detailed knowledge of court life. We know what emperors ate, wore, and said. We can reconstruct ceremonies from written descriptions. The archive preserves a level of detail about Tang palace life unmatched in earlier periods. The emperors who inhabited these spaces were human, ambitious, talented, flawed, sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous. But the institution they embodied transcended individuals. The Son of Heaven represented a cosmic principle. Heaven entrusted him with maintaining order between celestial and terrestrial realms. His moral cultivation affected natural phenomena. His rituals kept the cosmos balanced. This enormous responsibility justified the emperor's supreme authority. But it also weighed heavily. The pressure to perform rituals correctly, maintain virtue, and govern effectively could be crushing. Some emperors embraced the burden. Others crumbled under it. All were trapped within a system larger than themselves, performing roles scripted by centuries of tradition within palaces designed to display power they might not actually possess. The poets lament, golden age of art and literature, my era. Wine shops lined the streets near the markets. Scholars, poets, and officials gathered in these taverns to drink, recite verses, and discuss the affairs of the day. Tang Chang'an produced the finest poetry in Chinese history. The conditions aligned perfectly. A prosperous capital attracting talent, imperial patronage for the arts, an educated class with leisure to create, and a cultural confidence that enabled experimentation. Li Bai wandered into this scene around 742 CE. His reputation as a poet preceded him. He had traveled extensively, writing verses that captured landscapes, friendships, and wine-soaked revelries with equal brilliance. Emperor Xuanzong summoned him to court. For a time, Li Bai enjoyed imperial favor. He composed verses celebrating the dynasty's glory. But his heavy drinking and disregard for protocol eventually led to his dismissal from court. He returned to wandering. Li Bai's poetry combined classical allusions with immediate emotional expression. He could write formally perfect regulated verse or loose ancient-style poetry. His images ranged from cosmic to intimate. He wrote about mountains as easily as wine cups. His most famous poem might be Drinking Alone Under the Moon, where he shares wine with the moon and his shadow, creating three companions from solitude. The verse perfectly captured his style, technically brilliant, emotionally direct, and tinged with both joy and melancholy. Li Bai represented the romantic ideal, the unrestrained genius following inspiration wherever it led. He wrote about Taoist immortals and mountain hermits as often as political themes. His life became legendary, including the probably fictional story of his drowning while drunkenly trying to embrace the moon's reflection. Du Fu offered a different model. Born into a scholar-official family, he struggled for years to pass examinations and gain appointment. He witnessed the Anlushan rebellion firsthand, enduring hardship and displacement. Du Fu's poetry combined technical mastery with moral seriousness and historical documentation. He wrote about social injustice, war's devastation, and personal suffering. His regulated verses adhered perfectly to tonal patterns and parallelism while conveying genuine emotion. His Song of the War Chariots described conscripts marching to war while their families wept. Ballad of the Army Carts detailed the burden military campaigns placed on common people. These poems documented historical reality while achieving literary excellence. Du Fu also wrote intimate verses about his family's poverty and his love for his children. Moonlit Night imagined his wife watching the same moon while they were separated by war. The poem's tenderness contrasted with the harsh circumstances that produced it. Later critics considered Du Fu the greatest Chinese poet. His combination of formal perfection and moral depth became the standard. His unflinching honesty about suffering and injustice demonstrated poetry's capacity for social critique. The contrast between Li Bai and Du Fu, romantic spontaneity versus moral seriousness, natural genius versus learned craft, influenced Chinese poetry for centuries. But both men lived in Chang'an during its peak and drew inspiration from the city's cultural richness. Countless other poets filled the capital's literary scene. Wang Wei combined poetry with landscape painting and Buddhist meditation. His verses captured natural scenes with vivid immediacy while suggesting deeper philosophical meanings. Baizhui, slightly later, wrote poetry deliberately accessible to common people. He circulated drafts to old women to ensure clarity. His Song of Everlasting Sorrow about Emperor Xuanzong and Yang Guifei became one of China's most famous narrative poems. Poetry competitions were common entertainment. Officials would gather and someone would propose a theme. Poets would compose verses following specific forms and rhyme schemes. The results were judged and discussed. Wine shops hosted poetry gatherings. The drinking culture and poetic culture intertwined. Many poems celebrated or lamented wine. The connection between alcohol and inspiration became a literary trope. Calligraphy elevated poetry beyond mere words. The greatest poets were often skilled calligraphers. Their handwritten poems became treasured artworks. The visual form of characters on silk or paper added another aesthetic dimension. The Tang period established regulated verse forms that balanced freedom and constraint. The Lushi form required 8 lines of 5 or 7 characters each, with tonal patterns and parallelism in the middle couplets. Mastering this form demonstrated technical skill, but poets also wrote in freer ancient-style forms without strict tonal requirements. This allowed longer poems and more varied expression. The best poets moved fluently between forms, choosing the structure that fit their content. Poetry served social functions beyond art. Officials used poems to communicate subtly about politics. Friends exchanged poems as letters. Farewell poems marked departures. Poems celebrated occasions or mourned losses. The examination system included poetry composition. Successful candidates needed to demonstrate poetic skill along with knowledge of classics. This made poetry central to education and social advancement. Women poets, though fewer in number and less recorded, contributed to Tang literary culture. Some courtesans achieved fame for their verses. A few aristocratic women had their work preserved. But the historical record tilts heavily toward male poets. Painting flourished alongside poetry. The Tang period saw landscape painting emerge as a major genre. Earlier Chinese art emphasized human figures and moral narratives. Now mountains, rivers, and natural scenes became worthy subjects themselves. Wang Wei exemplified the scholar-amateur ideal, a cultured official who painted for personal expression rather than commercial purposes. His landscapes suggested philosophical themes through natural imagery. Court painters worked in the palace, producing portraits and decorative art. The emperor commissioned religious paintings for temples. Official painting academies employed specialists. Figure painting remained important. Wu Daozi, perhaps the greatest Tang painter, created Buddhist murals in Chang'an temples. His work was famous for its vitality and movement. Though no original Wu Daozi paintings survive, later copies and descriptions convey his revolutionary style. Tang painting influenced Japanese and Korean art. Foreign monks brought styles back to their homelands. The international exchange of artistic ideas mirrored the commercial exchange along the Silk Road. Music enjoyed imperial patronage. Emperor Xuanzong was personally accomplished as a musician. He established the Peer Garden Academy to train court musicians. Thousands of performers studied there. Tang music incorporated foreign instruments and scales. Central Asian influences transformed Chinese musical traditions. The pipa lute became central to performances. Drums and wind instruments from various sources enriched the sonic palette. Court ceremonies featured elaborate musical performances. Different types of music accompanied different rituals. The emperor's movements had musical accompaniment. State banquets featured concerts. Poetry and music connected through song. Many poems were written to be sung. The words and melodies formed integrated wholes. Though Tang melodies are lost, we can infer their character from poetic meter and contemporary descriptions. Dance performances combined movement, music, and spectacle. The rainbow skirt and feather jacket dance, associated with Yang Guifei and possibly choreographed by Emperor Xuanzong himself, became legendary. Foreign dancers introduced new styles. Theater developed during the Tang, though it wouldn't reach full maturity until later dynasties. Court entertainments included dramatic performances with costumes and simple staging. Prose writing also flourished. Han Yu and Liu Zongyuan led a movement advocating clearer, more direct prose styles based on classical models. They opposed the ornate parallel prose popular in earlier centuries. Han Yu's essays combined philosophical argument with vivid expression. His memorial on the Buddha bone criticized Buddhism and almost got him executed. But Emperor Xuanzong appreciated capable writers and commuted the sentence to exile. Historical writing continued Sima Qian's tradition. The official history of the Sui dynasty was completed during the Tang. Encyclopedic works compiled knowledge across fields. Libraries preserved texts and generated new scholarship. The cultural production of Tang Chang'an occurred within a framework of imperial patronage and educated leisure. Wealthy families supported artists. Officials had time for creative pursuits. The examination system created a large class of educated people who valued literary culture. But the Anlushan Rebellion disrupted this world. Many artists experienced the war personally. Du Fu's later poetry documented his family's poverty and his wanderings through war-torn regions. The rebellion became itself a subject of art. Poets mourned the destruction. They wrote about displaced persons, burned cities, and lost loved ones. The contrast between the golden age before and the sorrow after shaped how the Tang came to be remembered. Yet art continued. The late Tang produced remarkable works. The trauma perhaps deepened artistic expression. Writers who had experienced catastrophe brought new perspectives. The golden age of Tang poetry set standards that influenced Chinese literature for centuries afterward. Later poets measured themselves against Li Bai and Du Fu. The forms perfected in the Tang remained dominant. The combination of artistic excellence and historical documentation makes Tang poetry uniquely valuable. We can read poems about specific locations in Chang'an, about historical events, about individuals we know from other sources. The poetry provides both aesthetic pleasure and historical evidence. Walking through Chang'an at its height meant encountering this artistic culture constantly. Calligraphy decorated buildings, poems were recited in wine shops. Music drifted from palaces and temples. The city was itself a work of art, planned and decorated with aesthetic principles guiding every choice. The poets who wandered those streets captured it all: the magnificence and the injustice, the beauty and the suffering, the pride and the doubt. Their verses preserved Tang Chang'an more vividly than any archaeological evidence could. In their words, the city lives still. The Buddha's light, spirituality, and monastic power. The giant Wild Goose Pagoda rose above the southern suburbs, visible from across the city. Built in 652 CE, its 7 stories housed Buddhist scriptures that Xuanzang had carried from India. Buddhism dominated Tang's spiritual life. By the 7th century, it had evolved from a foreign import into an integral part of Chinese culture. Chang'an housed hundreds of Buddhist temples, employed thousands of monks and nuns, and attracted pilgrims from across Asia. The relationship between Buddhism and the state was complex. Emperors patronized Buddhism for various reasons: genuine faith, desire for cosmic protection, political calculation. Buddhist institutions accumulated wealth and influence that sometimes rivaled state power. Temple construction consumed enormous resources. The Xi'an temple's main hall could hold thousands of worshippers. Gilded bronze Buddha statues stood 15 meters tall. Wall paintings covered every surface. Pagodas required years of work by skilled craftsmen. Wealthy families donated land and money to temples. This generated tax-exempt income for monasteries while allowing donors to gain religious merit. Over time, Buddhist institutions became major landholders. Monasteries operated as economic enterprises. They managed agricultural estates worked by dependent laborers. Some temples ran mills or oil presses. They made loans at interest. The larger monasteries functioned as banks and landlords. This economic power attracted criticism. Confucian officials argued that Buddhism drained resources from productive use. Land tied up in tax-exempt temple holdings couldn't support the state. Men who became monks didn't farm, fight, or pay taxes. But Buddhism offered services the state valued. Monks performed rituals for imperial health and dynasty longevity. They prayed for rain during droughts. They conducted elaborate ceremonies on important occasions. The government could hardly afford to alienate such a powerful institution. The monastic system created its own hierarchy. Abbots administered major temples. The government appointed a chief monk to oversee all Buddhist institutions. Ordination certificates regulated who could become a monk, though illegal ordinations remained common. Monks pursued different paths. Some focused on meditation and sought personal enlightenment. Others specialized in doctrinal study, mastering complex philosophical texts. Ritual specialists performed ceremonies for lay donors. Administrative monks managed temple properties. Women could join the monastic life as nuns. They lived in separate convents with parallel hierarchies. Female monasticism offered educated women an alternative to marriage and family life. Some aristocratic women entered convents to escape unwanted marriages or widowhood. Buddhist philosophy engaged Chinese intellectuals. Various schools of thought competed for adherents. The Pure Land school emphasized faith in Amitabha Buddha and rebirth in his Western paradise. Chan Buddhism, which would become Zen in Japan, focused on meditation and sudden enlightenment. The Tian Tianhuan schools developed comprehensive philosophical systems that classified all Buddhist teachings hierarchically. Debates between schools could be heated. Adherents argued about which texts were supreme and which practices were most effective. Chang'an's temples became centers for translation work. Xuanzang's bureau at the giant Wild Goose Pagoda employed dozens of monks. They compared Sanskrit manuscripts, debated terminology, and produced Chinese versions that would shape East Asian Buddhism. This translation work required linguistic expertise. Monks needed to understand Sanskrit grammar and Buddhist technical vocabulary. They studied Indian phonology to transliterate mantras accurately. Some monks traveled to India specifically to improve their language skills. The scriptures they translated filled the pagoda's library. Thousands of scrolls contained Buddha's teachings, philosophical treatises, and ritual instructions. Scholars traveled to Chang'an to consult these resources. Buddhist art transformed Chang'an's visual landscape. Every temple featured statues of Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and protective deities. Craftsmen used bronze, stone, lacquer, and clay. They gilded surfaces and painted elaborate details. Wall paintings depicted Buddhist cosmology, heavens filled with celestial beings, hells teeming with suffering souls, and the human realm in between. Paradise scenes showed believers reborn among lotus flowers while Buddhas preached Dharma. These images served pedagogical purposes. Illiterate believers could learn Buddhist stories through pictures. The vivid hell scenes encouraged moral behavior through fear of karmic consequences. Cave temples in the regions around Chang'an showcased Buddhist art's evolution. The Longmen grottos near Luoyang and the Bingling Temple caves in Gansu contained thousands of Buddhist sculptures carved over centuries. Tang-era work showed increasingly naturalistic forms and distinctly Chinese features. Buddhist festivals punctuated the calendar. The Buddha's birthday in the fourth month brought processions through the streets. Temples displayed sacred relics. Believers lit lamps and made offerings. The city effectively paused for religious observance. Some emperors showed particular devotion. Emperor Gaozong and Empress Wu Zetian commissioned the magnificent Longmen Caves. Wu Zetian later used Buddhist concepts to justify her unprecedented rule as female emperor, claiming to be a reincarnated bodhisattva. But the state also constrained Buddhism when it became too powerful. Periodic restrictions limited ordinations. Officials criticized monastic wealth. Tensions simmered between the Buddhist establishment and Confucian bureaucrats. These tensions erupted in 845 CE under Emperor Wuzong. The great anti-Buddhist persecution confiscated temple property, returned monks and nuns to lay life, and destroyed religious art. Over 4,000 large temples and 40,000 smaller shrines faced demolition or conversion. The persecution stemmed from multiple motives. The emperor personally favored Daoism. Advisors emphasized Buddhism's foreign origins. Economic pressures made temple wealth attractive. Political factors included the influence of anti-Buddhist officials. The persecution devastated Chinese Buddhism. Though it ended with Emperor Wuzong's death in 8846 CE, Buddhism never recovered its earlier dominance. Schools that relied heavily on institutional support and textual study suffered most. Chan Buddhism, with its emphasis on meditation over institutions, weathered the crisis better. But we're ahead of the story again. During the height of Tang power, Buddhist institutions flourished. They provided social services, orphanages, hospitals, and charitable activities. They operated schools. They preserved texts and supported scholarship. The relationship between Buddhism and popular religion was complex. Common people blended Buddhist concepts with Taoist deities and folk beliefs. They visited temples to pray for practical benefits, sons, health, wealth. The sophisticated philosophy interested them less than ritual efficacy. Buddhist monasteries became safe places for travelers. The network of temples across the empire provided lodging and food. Monks offered medical care. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites relied on monastic hospitality. This created economic flows. Donations from travelers supplemented temple income. Successful temples attracted more pilgrims, generating more donations. Some temples became famous for particular miraculous images or relics. Buddhist influence extended to language and literature. Chinese absorbed Sanskrit loanwords. Buddhist concepts shaped how people thought about morality, causation, and the afterlife. Stories from Buddhist texts entered popular culture. The cosmological vision Buddhism offered was vast. The universe contained countless worlds, beings transmigrated through realms based on karma, time spanned incomprehensible aeons. This expanded Chinese imaginative horizons. Buddhist vegetarianism influenced food culture, though not universally. Monasteries developed sophisticated vegetable cuisine. Some lay believers adopted vegetarian diets during religious observances. The tradition of avoiding meat on certain days entered Chinese custom. Textual production for Buddhism was enormous. Monasteries copied scriptures by hand, considering the act religiously meritorious. The invention of woodblock printing in the Tang period soon put Buddhist texts among the first printed materials. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE, is the oldest dated printed book. Though printed slightly after our period, it demonstrates how Buddhism drove technological innovation in text reproduction. Chang'an's Buddhist culture connected China to a broader Asian religious sphere. Monks maintained contacts with Korean, Japanese, and Central Asian Buddhists. They exchanged texts, relics, and ideas. The city functioned as a node in an international Buddhist network. This religious cosmopolitanism mirrored the commercial cosmopolitanism of the Silk Road. Just as goods flowed through Chang'an, so did religious teachings. The city was simultaneously a commercial entrepot and a spiritual crossroads. The giant wild goose pagoda symbolized this role. It housed scriptures from India. Monks from Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia came to study there. The pagoda stood as a monument to Buddhist learning and Chinese imperial patronage. Looking up at that brick tower rising above the city, believers saw more than impressive architecture. They saw proof that the Dharma had traveled from India to China, that enlightenment was accessible, that the Buddha's compassion extended across all lands. In the shadow of that pagoda, in the halls of hundreds of temples, in the chants of thousands of monks, Buddhism shaped daily life in Tang Chang'an. It offered meaning, community, and hope. Whatever its political complications, it fulfilled deep spiritual needs for millions of believers. The Buddha's light, they believed, shone upon the capital, and in its glow, suffering could be understood and transcended. The An Lushan Rebellion, the fracture in the mirror. The year 755 marks a turning point in Chinese history. General An Lushan, a military commander of Sogdian and Turkic heritage, commands respect at the Tang court. Emperor Xuanzong trusts him. The imperial consort Yang Guifei adopts him as her son in an elaborate ceremony. Yet beneath this favor, ambition festers. And Lushan controls 3 military districts along the northeastern frontier. His forces number perhaps 160,000 troops, battle-hardened from campaigns against the Khitan peoples. Archaeological evidence from military registers shows these frontier armies possess superior training and equipment compared to units stationed in the interior. The empire has grown complacent during decades of prosperity. In the 11th month of 755, An Lushan marches south. His stated justification involves removing corrupt officials from court, particularly the chancellor Yang Guozhang, cousin to the emperor's beloved consort. The rebellion's true nature becomes clear quickly. This represents a bid for the throne itself. The speed of the initial advance stuns contemporary observers. Within weeks, rebel forces cross the Yellow River. Luoyang, the eastern capital, falls with minimal resistance in the first month of 756. Historical records describe the city's capture in stark terms. Officials flee or submit. The population faces pillage. And Lushan proclaims himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Xi'an. News reaches Chang'an like a thunderclap. The court debates responses. Some advisors recommend immediate evacuation. Others insist the capital's walls can withstand siege. Emperor Xuanzong, now in his 70s, struggles to comprehend how his trusted general has transformed into an existential threat. The Tang military response falters. Generals loyal to the dynasty mobilize troops, but coordination proves difficult. An army sent to block the rebel advance meets defeat at the Tong Pass, the strategic gateway protecting the approach to Chang'an from the east. Archaeological surveys of this mountain pass reveal why its loss proved so catastrophic. The pass represents the last major defensive position before the Wei River Valley and the capital itself. By the 6th month of 756, rebel forces approach the city. Panic spreads through Chang'an's population. The emperor makes a fateful decision. Rather than remain and face siege, the court will flee westward towards Sichuan, where loyal forces might regroup. This choice effectively abandons the city to its fate. The imperial procession departs through the western gates. Historical accounts describe a chaotic scene. Thousands of courtiers, servants, and guards crowd the roads. The emperor rides in his palanquin, the imperial consort Yang Guifei traveling nearby. But the crisis deepens at a place called Mawei Station, perhaps 40 kilometers west of the capital. The military escort mutinies. Soldiers blame Yang Guozhong and his cousin Yang Guifei for the catastrophe. They demand justice. The chancellor meets his end at the hands of angry troops. The soldiers then insist the consort must also face consequences. Historical sources differ on exact details, but the outcome remains clear. Yang Guifei perishes, either by her own hand or through forced action. She becomes perhaps the most famous casualty of the rebellion, immortalized in poetry for centuries to come. Emperor Xuanzong continues westward, broken. His son and heir apparent, Li Heng, separates from the main party and travels north to Lingwu, where loyal generals proclaim him the new emperor. He takes the title Suzong. China now has 2 Tang emperors, though Xuanzong soon abdicates formally. The dynasty fractures even as it fights for survival. Chang'an falls to rebel forces without a major battle. The city's immense walls, which once symbolized imperial invincibility, stand useless when abandoned from within. And Lushan's troops occupy the palace complexes. They loot treasuries accumulated over generations. Archaeological excavations of Tang-era hoards suggest wealthy families buried valuables during this period, hoping to return. Many never did. The occupation proves brutal. Population estimates remain uncertain, but demographic studies suggest hundreds of thousands either flee or perish. The city's cosmopolitan character suffers particularly. Foreign merchants, monks, and residents face suspicion and violence. The Western market, once vibrant with traders from across Asia, empties, yet the rebellion itself begins to fracture. And Lushan, possibly suffering from illness, grows paranoid and erratic. In 757, his own son arranges his demise. The Yan dynasty passes to An Qingshu, but leadership struggles continue. This internal chaos provides Tang forces opportunity. Emperor Suzong requests aid from an unexpected source. The Uyghur Khaganate, a Turkic power controlling the steppes north of China, agrees to send cavalry in exchange for substantial payments and trade privileges. This alliance proves crucial. Tang accounts describe Uyghur horsemen as decisive in multiple battles. In the 9th month of 757, a combined Tang and Uyghur force approaches Chang'an from the north. The rebel garrison prepares for siege, but morale has deteriorated. When assault begins, resistance collapses relatively quickly. The city returns to Tang control after more than a year of occupation, yet victory comes with cost. The Uyghur allies demand payment in plunder. They spend days looting whatever the rebels left behind. Emperor Suzong enters his recovered capital to find a shadow of the city he knew. Palace buildings show damage. Administrative records lie scattered or destroyed. The population has declined dramatically. Archaeological evidence from residential wards shows many homes abandoned and eventually demolished during this period, their materials scavenged. The war continues. Rebel forces hold Luoyang and territories across the northeast. Fighting drags on for 7 more years, finally ending in 763 when the last rebel commander submits. The official casualty estimates from Tang sources claim 36 million perished, though modern historians consider this number inflated. Even conservative demographic studies suggest death tolls in the millions, primarily from famine and disease accompanying the warfare. The rebellion's impact extends far beyond immediate destruction. The Tang court, desperate for military strength, grants unprecedented autonomy to regional commanders. These military governors, or jiedushi, gradually evolve into semi-independent warlords. The central government never fully reasserts control over provincial armies. Financially, the empire lies exhausted. The equal field system, which allocated land to peasant families, collapses. Tax revenues plummet. The government implements new levies, including commercial taxes previously considered beneath imperial dignity. The economic geography of China begins shifting eastward toward the productive Yangtze Valley and the Grand Canal network. Chang'an itself never fully recovers its former glory. Population estimates suggest the city reaches perhaps 600,000 during the late Tang period, compared to over 1 million before the rebellion. The cosmopolitan atmosphere diminishes. Foreign communities shrink. The city turns more inward, more Chinese, less universal. Culturally, the trauma echoes through Tang poetry. Du Fu, who lived through the rebellion's horror, writes some of his most powerful verses about the experience. His Spring Prospect describes returning to a ruined Chang'an where the nation broken, mountains and rivers remain. This melancholy awareness that even the greatest achievements can shatter informs late Tang literature. The psychological impact may prove most lasting. The High Tang represented an age of confidence, of expansion, of cultural certainty. That confidence dies at Mawei Station and in Chang'an's occupied streets. The late Tang period exhibits different characteristics: introspection, defensiveness, and awareness of vulnerability. The mirror of imperial perfection has cracked, and everyone can see the fissures. The slow fade, decline, and the move east. The Tang dynasty limps forward after 763, wounded but alive. Chang'an remains the capital, the symbolic center of empire, yet power increasingly resides elsewhere. The provincial military governors who helped suppress the rebellion now control their own armies, collect their own taxes, and sometimes pass their positions to sons without imperial approval. The central government presides over a nominal unity that masks actual fragmentation. Archaeological evidence from this period shows Chang'an's physical contraction. The outer wards, especially in the eastern sections, exhibit signs of abandonment. Foundations suggest residential buildings demolished without replacement. The city's population concentrates more densely in areas near the palace and administrative zones. The vast metropolis begins developing empty spaces within its walls. Economic power shifts eastward. The Yangtze River Valley and regions near the Grand Canal prosper, while the northwest stagnates. Agricultural productivity in the Guanzhong Plain, always dependent on irrigation, suffers from neglect of water management systems. Tax revenues from eastern provinces dwarf contributions from the capital region. Court documents reveal the government increasingly relies on grain shipments via the canal to feed Chang'an's population. Emperor Dizong, ruling from 779 to 805, attempts to reassert central authority. He moves against powerful governors in the northeast who have effectively established hereditary rule over their territories. The result brings fresh conflict. Rebel governors march on the capital in 783. Dizong flees Chang'an for the second time in Tang history, seeking refuge in modern Shanxi's Fengtian. The pattern from An Lushan's rebellion repeats. The emperor abandons his capital when threatened. Loyalist forces eventually restore Dizong to his throne, but the episode demonstrates the dynasty's weakness. A determined provincial governor can threaten the heart of empire. The emperor returns to a capital that feels less secure, less central to actual power. Archaeological studies of this period show increased fortification of inner palace areas, suggesting defensive concerns even within the city walls. The late Tang government experiments with policy reforms. The two-tax system replaces older tribute arrangements, attempting to rationalize revenue collection. Officials debate currency reforms and salt monopolies, yet these measures address symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental problem involves a weakened center trying to govern increasingly autonomous regions. Religiously, the period sees dramatic shifts. Buddhism, which flourished during the High Tang, faces growing criticism. Confucian scholars argue that monasteries drain wealth from the productive economy. Too much land sits tax-exempt in monastic hands. Too many able-bodied men live as monks instead of farmers or soldiers. Emperor Wuzong, influenced by Daoist advisors, launches a major persecution in 842 through 845. The Great Anti-Buddhist Persecution destroys thousands of temples and monasteries. Sources claim more than 4,600 major temples dismantled and 260,000 monks and nuns forced back into lay life. Archaeological evidence supports these claims. Excavations throughout China reveal Buddhist sites deliberately destroyed during this period. Metal Buddha statues melted for their material. Temple lands seized and returned to tax registers. Chang'an's religious landscape transforms. The great monasteries that once dominated districts of the city lie ruined or converted to other uses. The Great Wild Goose Pagoda survives, but its associated monastery operates on a reduced scale. Buddhism recovers somewhat after Wuzong's demise, but never regains its former institutional power. The city's spiritual character shifts accordingly. Literature from this era reflects growing pessimism. Poets write about decline, about lost glory, about the weight of history. Li Shangyin composes verses filled with obscure allusion and melancholy. The confident cosmopolitanism of Li Bai's generation gives way to more introspective, sometimes bitter perspectives. These writers know they inhabit an empire's twilight. The 9th century brings increasing instability. Provincial governors continue challenging central authority. Court politics grows toxic as eunuchs gain power over emperor selection and policy. The examination system still produces officials, but many positions go unfilled in provincial areas where governors prefer their own appointees. The bureaucratic machine that once efficiently administered an empire begins seizing. Natural disasters compound human failures. The Yellow River floods repeatedly. Droughts strike the northwest. Historical sources describe famines in the Guanzhong Plain itself, the ancient heartland reduced to importing food for survival. The Wei River, which once sustained Zhou and Han capitals, no longer provides sufficient irrigation for a large urban population. In 874, a failed examination candidate named Huang Chao leads a band of salt smugglers into open rebellion. The uprising begins in the east but grows as it moves. Dissatisfied peasants, displaced soldiers, and opportunistic bandits join. By 880, Huang Chao commands perhaps 600,000 followers, though this number likely includes many non-combatants seeking survival. Emperor Xizong receives reports of the rebel advance with alarm. His generals prove unable to stop Huang Chao's forces, which avoid major battles and move with surprising speed. In the 12th month of 880, the rebel army approaches Chang'an from the south. The emperor repeats the now familiar pattern, fleeing westward to Sichuan before the rebels arrive. Huang Chao enters Chang'an in the first month of 881. He proclaims a new dynasty, the Qi, and takes the title of emperor. Historical accounts describe this occupation as far more destructive than An Lushan's. Archaeological evidence supports this characterization. Excavations in palace areas show extensive fire damage datable to this period. Residential wards exhibit signs of systematic looting and burning. The occupation lasts nearly 3 years. Huang Chao's forces face supply problems feeding their army and the remaining urban population. Contemporary sources describe mass starvation. The city's infrastructure collapses. Water systems fail, sanitation disappears, disease spreads. Population estimates suggest Chang'an's inhabitants decline from perhaps 500,000 before the rebellion to under 100,000 during the occupation. In 883, Tang forces allied with Turkish mercenaries besiege the city. Huang Chao abandons Chang'an in the 6th month, retreating eastward. He meets his end the following year. Emperor Xizong returns to find his capital devastated. Archaeological surveys indicate large sections of the city lay in ruins. The palace complexes, damaged in previous conflicts, suffered fresh destruction. Many wards stood completely empty. The dynasty survives another quarter century, but in name only. Real power resides with military strongmen who control regions and nominally acknowledge Tang authority. Chang'an becomes less a true capital and more a symbolic placeholder. The government lacks resources to rebuild properly. The city contracts further within its walls. In 904, the warlord Zhu Wen forces the court to relocate to Luoyang. This represents the formal end of Chang'an's role as imperial capital. Zhu Wen claims he needs the emperor closer to eastern economic centers, but the move also asserts his control over the throne. 3 years later, in 907, he forces the last Tang emperor to abdicate. Zhu Wen proclaims himself emperor of a new dynasty, the later Liang. The Tang ends. Chang'an survives but transformed. The population perhaps reaches 50,000, a fraction of its former size. The great marketplace stands quiet. The palace complexes lie abandoned to wind and weather. The city that once welcomed envoys from across the world has become a provincial backwater. The archaeological record shows clearly that after 907, urban life concentrates in the northwestern corner of the old Tang city, near the Ming era center. The rest becomes farmland and ruins within the ancient walls. Yet something survives. The city's bones remain, buried beneath later construction. The Tang street grid, though abandoned, leaves traces in field boundaries and property lines. The city walls, though damaged, still stand in sections, and the memory persists. Chinese scholars and poets continue writing about Chang'an's glory for centuries to come, keeping alive the vision of what once existed in the Wei River Valley. The provincial city, life after the capital, the fall of the Tang inaugurates a period historians call the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. Northern China sees 5 brief dynasties rise and collapse between 907 and 960. The south fragments into regional kingdoms. None of these successor states choose the old capital in the Wei River Valley as their center of power. Chang'an, renamed Jingzhou during this period, becomes a secondary city in a fractured landscape. Archaeological evidence reveals the city's reduced circumstances. Excavations show the eastern half of the Tang city effectively abandoned. Farmers cultivate fields where wards once stood. The population concentrates in the northwestern sector, near the old imperial city. Estimates suggest perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 residents, compared to over 1 million during the High Tang. The walls remain standing but serve more to define boundaries than defend against serious military threats. The Song dynasty reunifies much of China in 960. Their founder, Emperor Taizu, establishes his capital at Kaifeng in the east, near the Grand Canal and the economic heartland. This choice reflects strategic calculation. The Guanzhong Plain no longer represents the geographic or economic center of Chinese civilization. Power has shifted to regions with better water transport and agricultural productivity. The Song renamed the city Yongqing Military Command, acknowledging its continued strategic importance for controlling the northwest. Military garrisons maintain order. Civilian administrators collect taxes, but the city serves primarily as a regional hub rather than a national center. Historical records describe a modest urban economy focused on local trade and agriculture. The Jin dynasty, established by Jurchen peoples from Manchuria, conquers northern China in the 1120s and pushes the Song court south. The city becomes part of Jin territory, administered as Anxi Prefecture. Archaeological finds from this period include Jin-era coins and ceramics showing continued habitation. The population likely remains stable, perhaps growing slightly as refugees from eastern war zones seek safety in the northwest. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century sweep across Asia. Genghis Khan's armies reach the city in 1227. The Mongols incorporate it into their vast empire as part of Shanxi province under the Yuan dynasty. The city receives a new name, Fengyuan. This period sees fresh construction, though on a much smaller scale than Tang times. Archaeological evidence includes Yuan-era administrative buildings and residential quarters. Trade revives somewhat under Mongol rule. The Yuan dynasty controls the entire Silk Road network from China to Eastern Europe. Merchants again move through the northwest, though in smaller numbers than during Tang days. The city benefits from this renewed caravan traffic. Markets handle goods from across Eurasia. Persian carpets, Indian spices, and Russian furs appear in local inventories. The Ming dynasty emerges from Chinese rebellion against Mongol rule. Their founding emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, establishes his capital at Nanjing, but recognizes the Northwest's strategic importance. His son, the Yongle emperor, eventually moves the capital to Beijing, but maintains strong interest in securing the western territories. The Ming rename the city Xi'an, literally Western Peace. This name endures into the present day. The designation reflects the city's position on China's northwestern frontier, facing toward Central Asia and potential threats from steppe peoples. The Ming government appoints powerful princes and military commanders to administer the region. Between 1370 and 1378, the Ming construct new city walls. These fortifications, which survive today as Xi'an's most famous landmark, represent sophisticated military engineering. Rammed earth cores sheathed in brick, measuring roughly 12 meters high and 15 to 18 meters thick at the base. The rectangular perimeter runs approximately 14 kilometers, much smaller than the Tang-era walls. This contraction reflects reduced urban population but improved defensive capability. Archaeological surveys show the Ming walls enclose primarily the old Tang northwestern sector, essentially formalizing the urban contraction that occurred after the Tang collapse. The walls include 4 main gates aligned with the cardinal directions, plus several smaller passages. Watchtowers dot the perimeter. Corner towers provide enhanced observation and defensive fire angles. Within the walls, the Ming develop a new urban layout. A bell tower rises near the center, marking the city's heart. A drum tower stands nearby. These structures serve both practical and symbolic functions. Bells and drums mark time for the urban population. They also represent administrative authority and cosmic order. The bell tower undergoes reconstruction in 1739 under the Qing, taking the form visible today. Ming Xi'an serves as headquarters for defending Shanxi province and monitoring the Ordos region to the north. Military registers indicate substantial garrison forces. The government maintains granaries for emergency supplies. Officials supervise irrigation systems in the Guanzhong Plain, attempting to maintain agricultural productivity. The city develops a reputation as a center for Han Chinese culture and traditional scholarship. Libraries preserve classical texts. Schools train students in Confucian classics for the examination system. The Forest of Stone Stels begins accumulating its collection, preserving inscriptions and texts carved in stone. Scholars from across China visit to study these historical documents. Religious life adapts to the city's reduced scale. Buddhist temples operate but lack the vast wealth and political influence of Tang times. Taoist temples serve local communities. Islamic communities, descendants of merchants and travelers who arrived during earlier dynasties, maintain mosques. The Great Mosque, parts of which date to Ming times, represents significant Islamic architecture with Chinese characteristics. Economic activity focuses on regional trade rather than international commerce. Local markets handle agricultural produce from the surrounding plain. Craftsmen produce ceramics, textiles, and metalwork for provincial consumption. Some specialty goods, particularly certain types of jade carving and stonework, maintain reputations for quality. The Ming period sees steady urban development within the walls. Archaeological excavations reveal residential quarters organized along a grid pattern, though less rigidly than Tang times. Elite families maintain compounds with gardens and courtyards. Merchants and craftsmen occupy shophouses along commercial streets. The population gradually increases, reaching perhaps 200,000 by the late Ming era. Natural disasters periodically strike. Earthquakes, particularly severe ones in 1556 and 1568, caused significant damage and loss of life. The 1556 Shanxi earthquake represents one of history's deadliest, killing hundreds of thousands across the region. Historical records describe city walls cracking and buildings collapsing. The population rebuilds, demonstrating resilience even in adversity. The Ming collapse in 1644 brings fresh turmoil. Rebel forces occupy Xi'an before the Manchu Qing dynasty consolidates control. The transition involves fighting and disruption, but Xi'an avoids the catastrophic destruction of earlier dynastic transitions. The Qing a functioning provincial city with intact infrastructure. Under Qing rule, Xi'an continues serving as Shanxi's provincial capital. The Manchu government maintains the Ming administrative structure. A Manchu garrison occupies the northeastern section of the city, forming a distinct community. The wall subdivides internally to separate Manchu and Han residential areas, though this division gradually blurs over time. The Qing period sees continued cultural development. The Forest of Stone Stels expands significantly. Scholars catalog and preserve historical inscriptions. The collection includes texts from Han through Ming times, creating an extraordinary historical archive. Officials and literati visit to study the stones, rubbing copies to take home. Educational institutions flourish. The city maintains multiple academies where students prepare for civil service examinations. Libraries preserve rare texts. Literary societies meet to discuss classical works and compose poetry. Xi'an becomes known as a center for traditional learning, contrasting with more cosmopolitan coastal cities embracing Western influences. The 19th century brings new challenges. The Taiping Rebellion, though centered in southern China, disrupts trade routes and causes economic stress. Muslim rebellions in the northwest during the 1860s and 1870s reached Shanxi, causing significant bloodshed and population displacement. Xi'an serves as a government stronghold during these conflicts, sheltering refugees and coordinating military responses. By the late Qing period, Xi'an remains a substantial regional city of perhaps 300,000 inhabitants. The Ming walls still define its boundaries. The street layout preserves elements from various dynasties. Architecture ranges from Ming-era residential buildings to Qing administrative structures. The city represents continuity, a living link to China's long history, even as the empire faces foreign pressures and internal decay. The city's position far from coastal treaty ports means limited direct Western influence. While Shanghai and Guangzhou develop foreign concessions and modern industries, Xi'an maintains traditional character. This isolation proves both curse and blessing. The city avoids colonial exploitation but also misses early modernization opportunities. The ancient capital sleeps, preserved almost by neglect, awaiting future awakening. The Mongol interlude, Kublai Khan and Marco Polo. The Mongol Empire erupts across Eurasia during the 13th century. Genghis Khan's armies reach northern China in the early 1200s, beginning decades of conflict that ultimately submerged the Jin and southern Song dynasties. His grandson, Kublai Khan, completes the conquest, establishing the Yuan dynasty in 1271. For the first time, foreign conquerors rule all of China. Kublai Khan chooses Beijing as his primary capital, renaming it Dadu, or Great Capital. This decision reflects strategic considerations. Beijing sits closer to the Mongol homeland in the steppes. It occupies a pivotal position for controlling northern China while maintaining connections to Central Asia. The choice also represents a break from Chinese tradition, which often favored more centrally located capitals. Xi'an, known during this period as Fengyuan and later as Anxi, becomes a regional administrative center within Shanxi province. The Mongols recognized the area's strategic importance for controlling trade routes and military access to Central Asia. They stationed governors and military commanders in the city. Archaeological evidence shows Yuan-era administrative buildings and garrison facilities. The Mongol approach to governance differs markedly from Chinese predecessors. They establish a racial hierarchy with Mongols at the top, followed by foreign auxiliaries called Semu people, then Northern Chinese, with Southern Chinese at the bottom. This system affects Xi'an's population composition. Mongol officials and soldiers form an elite community. Central Asian merchants and administrators from Persian and Turkic backgrounds settle in the city. They conduct trade and serve the Yuan government. The Yuan dynasty revives overland Silk Road commerce. Mongol control extends from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, creating unprecedented security for long-distance caravans. Merchants can travel from Xi'an to Persia or the Mediterranean without crossing hostile borders. This reunification of the Silk Road benefits the city. Markets handle increased volumes of luxury goods, silk traveling west, Persian, and Central Asian products flowing east. Historical records describe significant rebuilding efforts. The Mongols repair irrigation systems damaged during the conquest wars. They reconstruct portions of the city walls. New residential quarters house officials and merchants. Yuan documents mention Buddhist temples receiving imperial patronage, continuing traditions from earlier Chinese dynasties while adding Tibetan Buddhist influences favored by Mongol rulers. The question of Marco Polo's presence in China has generated scholarly debate. Polo's narrative, dictated while imprisoned in Genoa and published as The Travels, describes a journey to the court of Kublai Khan and years of service to the empire. He claims to have traveled extensively throughout Yuan territories. However, the text never explicitly mentions Xi'an or Fengyuan by name. Researchers examining Polo's account note several issues. Chinese sources from the period make no mention of a Venetian official serving Kublai Khan. Details in Polo's narrative sometimes contradict archaeological and documentary evidence from Yuan China. For instance, he fails to mention certain distinctive Chinese cultural practices like tea drinking or foot binding that would surely have struck a foreign observer. Some scholars suggest Polo might have compiled his account from second-hand sources, perhaps Persian or Central Asian merchant tales, without personally reaching China. Others propose he did travel to China but exaggerated his access and importance at the Yuan court. A third view maintains the essential accuracy of his journey while acknowledging embellishments and errors in the published text. If Polo did travel through northwestern China, he likely passed through Xi'an's region. The standard overland route to Beijing from Central Asia crossed Shanxi. Caravans stopped at major cities for supplies and rest. Yet the absence of specific references to Xi'an in his narrative, combined with the text's other problematic elements, makes confirmation impossible based on current evidence. What remains certain is that Xi'an during the Yuan period saw significant international contact. Central Asian merchants operated in the city. Persian-speaking administrators served the Mongol government. Tibetan Buddhist monks visited and established monasteries. Archaeological finds include Yuan-era coins, ceramics with Central Asian influences, and religious artifacts from diverse traditions. The city maintained cosmopolitan character, though on a smaller scale than Tang Chang'an. The Yuan government institutes administrative reforms affecting Xi'an. They established the province system that becomes standard for subsequent Chinese dynasties. Shanxi constitutes one province, with Xi'an serving as capital. Provincial governors wield considerable authority over taxation, justice, and local military forces. This system proves more efficient than earlier arrangements and survives the Yuan collapse. Agricultural administration receives attention. The Mongols recognize that feeding their empire requires productive farming. Officials supervise irrigation, provide relief during famines, and maintain granaries. Historical records document efforts to restore the Guanzhong Plains' agricultural capacity after decades of warfare. These measures achieve partial success, though the region never regains its earlier productivity. The Yuan period sees continued Buddhist and Daoist development. The Mongols generally practice religious tolerance, allowing various faiths to coexist. Tibetan Buddhism receives special favor from the imperial court, leading to increased influence. In Xi'an, Tibetan lamas establish monasteries alongside older Chinese Buddhist institutions. Taoist temples continue operating. Islamic mosques serve the growing Central Asian Muslim community. Trade routes through Shanxi carry diverse goods. Archaeological excavations reveal Yuan-era trade goods, Persian metalwork, Central Asian glassware, and ceramics from across China. The city's markets handle everything from everyday necessities to luxury items. Merchants from different backgrounds negotiate in multiple languages. This commercial vitality benefits the local economy. The Black Death, which devastates Eurasia in the mid-14th century, likely affects Xi'an. The plague spreads along trade routes, and Shanxi's position on the Silk Road makes exposure probable. Historical sources from this period are limited, but demographic studies suggest population decline across China during these decades. Urban centers typically suffer higher mortality rates during plague outbreaks. The Yuan dynasty weakens in the mid-1300s. Imperial succession disputes, natural disasters, and economic problems erode Mongol authority. Chinese resistance movements emerge, particularly in the south. By the 1360s, rival claimants fight for control across China. Xi'an witnesses military campaigns as different factions contest Shanxi province. In 1368, the rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang establishes the Ming dynasty, driving the Mongols back to the steppes. His armies capture Xi'an, ending Yuan control over the northwest. The transition involves fighting but avoids massive destruction. The city passes to Ming administration relatively intact, allowing continuity in urban life despite the dynastic change. The Yuan interlude leaves lasting impacts on Xi'an's development. The provincial administrative system continues under the Ming. The city's position on revived trade routes establishes commercial networks that persist. The diverse population introduced during Mongol rule contributes to Xi'an's cultural mix, and the city's experience under foreign rulers provides precedent for later adaptations under the Qing dynasty. The question of whether Marco Polo personally witnessed Yuan Xi'an remains unresolved, but the city he might have seen would have displayed intriguing characteristics. A regional capital of moderate size, populated by Mongols, Central Asians, and Chinese, markets handling goods from across Eurasia, a blend of architectural styles and religious institutions, and the enduring presence of ancient ruins reminding all inhabitants of former glories. Whether seen through Venetian eyes or only through historical reconstruction, Yuan Xi'an represents a distinctive moment in the city's long transformation. The Ming fortress, walls, bells, and a new identity. The Ming dynasty emerges from rebellion against Mongol rule. Zhu Yuanzhang, a former Buddhist monk turned rebel leader, drives the Yuan court back to the steppes and proclaims himself Hongwu Emperor in 1368. His new regime faces the challenge of rebuilding a war-torn realm and establishing legitimacy. Xi'an, captured by Ming forces in 1369, becomes central to northwest frontier security. Hongwu Emperor assigns his second son, Zhu Shuang, as Prince of Qin, with Xi'an as his capital. This represents a return to ancient tradition. The title Prince of Qin echoes the dynasty that first unified China from this region 1,500 years earlier. The young prince receives responsibility for defending Shanxi and monitoring threats from the northwest steppes where Mongol remnants still pose dangers. The most visible Ming legacy begins construction in 1370. The government undertakes building new defensive walls, replacing damaged structures from earlier eras. This project continues intermittently until 1378, employing thousands of workers. The result transforms Xi'an into one of China's best fortified cities. The Ming walls represent sophisticated military engineering. Workers dig deep trenches and compact earth layers to create a foundation. They then build up rammed earth cores, packing soil mixed with lime and glutinous rice extract into wooden frames. Once dry, these cores gain remarkable strength. Finally, crews face the walls with fired bricks, creating weather-resistant surfaces. The technique produces walls roughly 12 meters high and 15 to 18 meters thick at the base, tapering somewhat toward the top. The rectangular perimeter measures approximately 13.7 kilometers. This encloses an area much smaller than Chang'an's outer walls, but reflects realistic population needs and defensive requirements. Archaeological surveys show the Ming walls primarily encompass the old Tang northwestern sector, formalizing the urban contraction that occurred after the 9th century. 4 main gates pierce the walls, aligned with cardinal directions. The south gate, called Yongning, faces the Zhongnan Mountains. The north gate, Anyuan, looks toward the Wei River and the steppe beyond. The east gate, Changla, opens toward the rest of China. The west gate, Anding, faces the Silk Road routes. Each gate features a complex structure, an outer gatehouse, a courtyard, and an inner gatehouse, creating a defensive buffer zone. Additional architectural features enhance defense. 98 ramparts project outward from the walls, allowing defenders to provide flanking fire against attackers. Crenellations top the walls, giving archers and crossbowmen protected firing positions. 4 corner towers offer enhanced observation points. A moat surrounds the exterior. Though it proves less formidable than the walls themselves, the walls serve multiple purposes beyond military defense. They define urban boundaries, separating city from countryside. They control access, allowing authorities to monitor who enters and exits. They project imperial authority, demonstrating Ming power through monumental architecture. And they provide psychological security, giving residents confidence in their protection. Within the walls, the Ming government organizes urban space according to traditional Chinese principles. The city's center receives a bell tower, originally constructed in 1384. This structure marks the symbolic heart of Xi'an, where the city's 2 main streets intersect. The tower houses large bronze bells used to signal time. Dawn bells wake the city. Evening bells announce curfew. The sound carries throughout the urban area. A drum tower rises northwest of the bell tower in 1380. This structure contains large drums that complement the bells in marking time and signaling important events. The presence of both bell and drum towers reflects classical Chinese urban design, creating architectural landmarks visible throughout the city. Both structures survive to the present, though they undergo renovations in subsequent centuries. The bell tower's original location occupies the western part of the city. In 1582, during the Ming Wanli reign, authorities relocate it to the current central position. This move reflects urban development patterns and desires to better center administrative authority. The relocation demonstrates sophisticated engineering. Workers dismantle the tower and reassemble it at the new site, preserving the original structure. Ming Xi'an develops a clear street pattern. Two main avenues, running north-south and east-west, cross at the bell tower. Secondary streets create a grid network, though less rigidly geometric than Tang Chang'an's layout. Residential neighborhoods organize around these streets. Markets operate in designated areas. Administrative buildings cluster near the center. The Prince of Qin maintains a palace complex in the central district. Historical records describe extensive gardens, pavilions, and ceremonial halls. Archaeological evidence confirms a substantial palace area, though later reconstruction obscures many Ming details. The prince wields considerable authority in Shanxi, commanding military forces and overseeing civil administration. The Ming government prioritizes military readiness. Substantial garrison forces occupy barracks within the city and surrounding areas. Training grounds allow drill practice. Armories store weapons and armor. The city serves as a forward base for operations against steppe peoples and potential internal rebellions. Historical records document military campaigns launched from Xi'an throughout the Ming period. Economic life adapts to the city's military character. Merchants supply garrison needs, food, textiles, metal goods, and other necessities. Craftsmen produce military equipment. Farmers in the surrounding Guanzhong plain grow crops for the urban market. The government maintains granaries with strategic reserves against siege or famine. The Ming restoration of the Grand Canal revitalizes north-south trade, but this benefits eastern cities more than Xi'an. The northwestern location means the city remains somewhat peripheral to main commercial networks. However, regional trade continues. Xi'an handles goods from Gansu and further west, serving as an entrepot for northwestern commerce. Religious institutions adapt to Ming patronage patterns. Buddhist temples receive less state support than during earlier dynasties but continue operating. The government favors Confucian orthodoxy, establishing schools and academies for examination preparation. Taoist temples serve local communities. The Muslim population grows, maintaining mosques and halal markets in designated quarters. The Great Mosque undergoes expansion during the Ming period. This institution serves Muslims descended from Tang and Yuan-era settlers, plus new arrivals from Central Asia. The mosque's architecture demonstrates cultural synthesis, Chinese building techniques and decorative elements housing Islamic worship spaces. Inscriptions in Arabic and Chinese testify to the community's bicultural identity. The city develops distinct neighborhoods. Scholars and officials occupy compounds near the bell tower. Merchants cluster along commercial streets. Craftsmen work in specialized quarters, potters in one area, metalworkers in another. The Manchu garrison that arrives in Qing times will occupy a separate district, but during the Ming, the population remains predominantly Han Chinese. Natural disasters pose recurring challenges. The great 1556 Shanxi earthquake causes tremendous damage. Historical sources describe this as possibly the deadliest earthquake in human history, taking hundreds of thousands of lives across the region. Xi'an's walls crack. Buildings collapse. The population suffers grievous losses. Reconstruction requires years but demonstrates urban resilience. Lesser earthquakes strike in 1568 and other years. The region's seismic activity demands robust construction. The Ming Wall's massive thickness helps them survive earthquakes relatively intact. Residential buildings prove more vulnerable. Archaeological evidence shows periodic reconstruction after seismic events. The late Ming period sees urban cultural development. Libraries preserve classical texts. Scholars compile local histories and gazetteers documenting Xi'an's past. The forest of stone stelae grows as officials and collectors add inscriptions. This accumulation creates an invaluable historical archive spanning Han through Ming times. Education flourishes within the city. Multiple academies prepare students for civil service examinations. Despite Xi'an's distance from the empire's political center, local scholars regularly pass examinations and receive official appointments. The city maintains a reputation for classical learning and historical consciousness. By the late Ming, Xi'an houses perhaps 200,000 residents. The population concentrates within the walls, creating urban density while leaving some inner areas for gardens and open spaces. The city exhibits clear hierarchical organization: administrative center, commercial districts, residential neighborhoods, and military quarters. The walls define boundaries and shape urban identity. The Ming collapse in 1644 brings turmoil. Rebel forces under Li Zicheng, himself from Shanxi, briefly occupy Xi'an before moving east toward Beijing. The Manchu Qing dynasty subsequently conquers China. Xi'an transitions to new rulers but retains its fortifications and urban structure. The Ming walls prove their worth, protecting the city through dynastic transition. The Ming period establishes Xi'an's physical form that persists into modern times. The walls, gates, bell tower, and drum tower define the city's identity. The street pattern shapes traffic flow and neighborhood organization. The fortress character reflects northwestern frontier realities. When the Qing inherit Xi'an, they receive a well-fortified regional capital whose physical structure requires little modification, allowing them to focus on administrative consolidation rather than urban reconstruction.